Welcome, fellow dreamer. Tonight, we journey through the luminous history of painting, from the first pigments pressed against stone walls to the radiant canvases of the Renaissance, discovering the inspired souls and ingenious methods that taught humanity to capture wonder itself. This story unfolds alongside soothing music and gentle abstract imagery, revealing hidden marvels and captivating tales designed to nourish your curiosity as you drift peacefully towards sleep. So take a slow, deep breath. Let yourself sink into softness and allow your mind and eyes to rest as the tale begins. Deep within the limestone hills of southwestern France, there exists a chamber that time nearly forgot. For 17,000 years, it lay in perfect darkness, sealed by a rockfall that closed its entrance like a door shutting on the distant past. When 4 teenagers and their dog stumbled upon this hidden gallery in 1940, they became the first human eyes in millennia to witness what flickered to life in their lamplight. The walls of Lascaux cave blazed with animals, horses galloping in herds, massive aurochs bulls stretching nearly 17 feet across the stone, delicate deer with magnificent antlers, and creatures long vanished from the earth. These were not crude scratches or simple outlines, but paintings rendered with such vitality and skill that the discoverers could scarcely believe what they were seeing. This was not humanity's first art, nor even its finest from that distant epoch. In northern Spain, the cave of Altamira holds paintings that may be even older, dating back perhaps 40,000 years to a time when our species shared the European landscape with Neanderthals. The famous bison painted on Altamira's ceiling show an understanding of form and volume that seems impossibly sophisticated for such remote antiquity. The unknown artists used the natural bulges and contours of the rock itself to give their animal subjects a three-dimensional quality, letting the stone's own curves suggest the musculature of a shoulder or the roundness of a haunch. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine the sensory world of these first painters. They lived in an age without artificial light. Beyond the fire, they could coax from wood and tinder. Venturing into the deep chambers of caves meant carrying primitive lamps, hollows in stone filled with animal fat, with a wick of moss or juniper to hold the flame. By this wavering golden light, artists worked on the uneven surfaces of cave walls, sometimes in chambers so remote from the entrance that they would have traveled through hundreds of feet of absolute darkness to reach their canvas of stone. What materials did these ancient painters have at their disposal? They worked with what the earth itself provided. Ochre, a clay colored by iron oxide, gave them shades ranging from golden yellow to deep russet red. Manganese dioxide and charcoal from their fires provided black. White came from kaolin clay or calcite. These pigments were ground into powder, sometimes using stones that show clear evidence of being worn smooth by this very purpose. The powder might be mixed with water or with animal fat to help it adhere to stone, or even with the natural calcium-rich water that seeped through limestone caves, which would help bind the pigment to the wall as it dried. Application methods varied with surprising sophistication. Sometimes painters used their fingers, and we can see the tracks of fingertips in certain marks. Other times they fashioned brushes from animal hair or plant fibers. In some caves, we find evidence of something even more intriguing: the outline of human hands created by a stencil technique. The artist would place their hand flat against the wall and blow pigment around it, either directly from their mouth or through a hollow bone or reed used as a tube. When they removed their hand, its ghostly negative image remained, a signature across millennia that speaks directly to us. I was here. I existed. But why did they create these images at all? This question has occupied researchers for more than a century, and the answer likely contains multiple truths rather than a single explanation. Some chambers appear to have been gathering places where communities might have come together for ceremonies or storytelling. The paintings could have played roles in rituals related to hunting, though this interpretation has fallen somewhat out of favor, since the animals most frequently depicted were not always the same species that formed the majority of these people's diet, based on bone remains found at their living sites. Perhaps these paintings served purposes we might consider spiritual or religious, marking certain caves as special places set apart from everyday existence. The very act of journey-making deep underground into spaces of profound darkness and silence suggests these were not casual undertakings. Some of the painted chambers are difficult to access even today, requiring crawling through narrow passages or navigating treacherous footing. These were destinations that required commitment and perhaps courage to reach. The animals themselves were chosen with care. Horses appear frequently, their forms captured in profile with remarkable accuracy. The great cattle called aurochs, ancestors of domestic cattle but much larger and more formidable, dominate many compositions. We see deer, ibex, and mammoths. Predators appear less frequently, but when they do, they carry undeniable power. The cave lions and bears that shared the Ice Age landscape with human communities. Birds and fish appear rarely, and plants almost never, suggesting that the focus was specifically on certain kinds of animals, rather than representing the environment as a whole. Human figures are notably uncommon in this early art, and when they do appear, they're often rendered more abstractly than the animals. In Lascaux, one enigmatic scene shows what appears to be a human figure with a bird-like head near a wounded bison. But the meaning of this composition remains mysterious. The contrast is striking. These artists who could capture the curve of a horse's neck or the power in a bull's shoulders with such precision seem to have deliberately chosen not to depict their own kind with the same naturalistic attention. Some caves show evidence of being painted over long periods, perhaps centuries, with new images added layer upon layer. This suggests that these were not one-time projects, but rather places that held continuing significance, drawing artists back again and again. The technique could vary even within a single cave, from simple outline drawings to fully polychromatic paintings that used multiple colors and shading to create remarkably lifelike representations. The preservation of these paintings is itself somewhat miraculous. Protected from sunlight, and until their modern discovery, from the moisture and pollutants that human presence brings, the pigments remain vibrant across an almost inconceivable span of time. Sadly, some caves, including Lascaux itself, have had to be closed to general visitors because the carbon dioxide from human breath and the moisture we bring with us began to damage what survived so many millennia untouched. These first artists left no written records, no names, no explanations of their intentions. Yet their work speaks across the ages with peculiar clarity. In the grace of a running deer or the power of a charging bison, we recognize an impulse that still drives artists today: the desire to capture something of the world's beauty, to make a mark that says this mattered, this was important, this deserved to be remembered. As the first chapter in the painting's long story, these cave walls hold all the essential elements that would continue through every age to follow: careful observation, technical skill, meaningful subject matter, and the mysterious human compulsion to transform what we see and feel into images that others can witness. As we prepare to leave these painted caves and journey forward in time toward the first great civilizations, let these ancient images rest gently in your mind: horses running in the lamplight, hands pressed against stone, the first brushstrokes in a story that has never stopped unfolding. As humanity emerged from the shadows of prehistory and began gathering into the world's first cities, painting transformed from the mysterious images on cave walls into something more organized, more purposeful, more connected to the rhythms of daily life and the structures of society. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and along the life-giving waters of the Nile, painting became systematic, symbolic, and intimately tied to power, religion, and the eternal. The Sumerians, who built their civilization in ancient Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, decorated their temples with paintings that have largely disappeared, victims of time and the fragile materials they used. Unlike stone carvings that could endure millennia, the painted plaster that once adorned mud brick walls crumbled away. What fragments remain suggest a world of ceremony and devotion, where geometric patterns intertwined with representations of gods and kings, where the act of painting itself was considered sacred work. But it was in Egypt, that narrow ribbon of fertility stretching along the Nile through an ocean of desert, where painting developed into a sophisticated and remarkably consistent tradition that would endure for 3,000 years. The hot, dry climate of Egypt performed an unintentional service to history, preserving paintings that would have deteriorated in damper lands, allowing us to see across the centuries with remarkable clarity. Egyptian painters worked primarily in tombs, creating elaborate scenes on plastered walls that served a purpose far beyond decoration. These were not meant to be admired by living eyes for long. Once a tomb was sealed, the paintings continued their true work in darkness, providing the deceased with everything needed for the journey through the afterlife. Food and drink, servants and animals, family and festivals, all were painted onto chamber walls so that through ancient magic, these images might become real in the realm beyond death. The painters who created these tomb scenes followed conventions so strict and enduring that an artwork created under the Old Kingdom pharaohs would look remarkably similar to one painted 1,500 years later. This consistency was not a failure of imagination, but rather a deliberate choice, rooted in the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the divine order that governed all things. To paint in the traditional way was to align oneself with cosmic harmony, to create images that would function properly in the spiritual realm. The human figure in Egyptian painting appears distinctive to modern eyes. Bodies were shown according to a precise formula. The head in profile, but with the eye drawn as if seen from the front. Shoulders and chest facing forward, while the waist twisted to show hips and legs in profile again. This was not because Egyptian artists could not observe how bodies actually looked from a single viewpoint. Rather, they were painting what they knew to be true about the human form, showing each part from its most characteristic and recognizable angle. The goal was clarity and completeness, not the illusion of a single frozen moment. This approach, called aspective or conceptual representation, extended to everything Egyptian painters depicted. A pool of water might be shown from above as a rectangle, while the fish and plants within it appeared from the side. A garden scene would show trees as if viewed from ground level, but arranged around the perimeter of a pond shown in plan view. The effect feels puzzling at first, until you understand that these painters were creating a kind of visual inventory, a complete accounting of what existed in a space, rather than how it might appear from one particular spot. The painters ground their pigments from minerals that Egypt's deserts and trade networks provided in abundance. Black came from soot or charcoal, white from chalk or gypsum. Yellow and red in various shades came from ochre, those same iron-rich earths that the cave painters had used tens of thousands of years before. Blue, the color of the heavens and the Nile, came from azurite, or from an artificial pigment the Egyptians invented. A copper-based compound now called Egyptian blue. Perhaps the first synthetic pigment ever created. Green came from malachite, or from mixing blue and yellow. These mineral pigments were mixed with water and a binding medium, possibly egg or plant gum, then applied to walls prepared with a thin layer of plaster. The paint soaked in slightly, becoming part of the wall surface rather than simply sitting on top of it. This helped the images endure, though the painters could not have known their work would still be visible thousands of years later, when the tombs they sealed would be opened again by people from civilizations they could never have imagined. The artists worked by lamplight in these underground chambers, following preliminary sketches often drawn in red ochre on the white plaster surface. Master painters would sometimes correct these initial layouts in black. Then teams of painters filled in the compositions, working section by section, their brushes made from reeds frayed at the ends, or from strips of palm fiber. Egyptian painting also employed a meaningful system of scale. Important figures appeared larger than less important ones, regardless of their actual relative sizes or positions in space. A pharaoh might tower over his soldiers and servants. A tomb owner would dominate scenes from his own life. This hierarchical scale reflected the social and spiritual order. The painting itself embodied the structure of existence. The colors, too, carried meaning beyond simple representation. Green symbolized fertility and regeneration. Black represented the rich soil of the Nile Valley and also resurrection. White suggested purity and sacredness. Red could indicate life and victory, but also chaos and disorder. Blue connected earth to sky, the human to the divine. To paint was to manipulate these symbolic forces, to create images that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Similar traditions developed in Mesopotamia, though less has survived the damper climate and the region's tumultuous history. The palaces of Assyrian kings featured painted walls alongside their famous stone reliefs, with blues and reds enlivening scenes of royal hunts and military victories. Archaeological evidence suggests that the paints used there shared much in common with Egyptian pigments, minerals and plant materials carefully prepared and applied with intention. What united these ancient civilizations in their approach to painting was the sense that creating images was serious work connected to religion, power, and the fundamental structure of the world. These were not personal expressions or experiments in seeing. They were collective traditions, carefully taught and faithfully maintained, designed to serve purposes both practical and mystical. As we move forward from these ancient painting traditions, we will find the Mediterranean world developing new approaches, new techniques, and new ways of thinking about what a painting could be and do. But the legacy of Egypt and Mesopotamia remained, a foundation of purpose and symbolism upon which later innovations would build. The civilizations around the Mediterranean Sea discovered something remarkable about walls. Unlike the stone surfaces of Egypt or the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, walls covered with wet plaster offered painters an opportunity to create images that would become part of the wall itself, lasting for centuries with colors that remained fresh and vibrant. This technique, which we now call fresco, would produce some of the ancient world's most beautiful and revealing paintings. On the island of Crete, in the palaces of the Minoan civilization that flourished around 1500 years before the Common Era, artists created wall paintings unlike anything seen before in the Mediterranean world. These weren't the rigid, symbolic images of Egyptian tombs with their strict rules and formal poses. Instead, Minoan painters captured movement and life with a freedom that feels almost modern to our eyes today. In the great palace at Knossos, dolphins leap through blue waves along corridor walls. Young men and women, their skin painted in the convention of the time, with men in reddish brown and women in pale white, vault over the backs of charging bulls in displays of either sport or ritual that we still don't fully understand. The Minoans painted their palace walls with scenes from nature and court life that suggest a culture at ease with the world around them. Birds flit through gardens of lilies and roses. A prince or priest walks through a field of papyrus, his profile elegant and his bearing confident. These paintings were created using the true fresco technique, which required both skill and speed. The painter had to apply mineral pigments directly onto fresh, wet plaster. As the plaster dried, a chemical reaction occurred. The lime in the plaster combined with carbon dioxide in the air, creating a crystalline surface that locked the pigments into the wall itself. This meant the painter had to work quickly, completing each section while the plaster remained damp, and had to get the image right the first time. There was no possibility of painting over mistakes once the plaster had set. The pigments the Minoan artists used came from the earth and sea around them. Ochres provided yellows and reds. Ground limestone gave them white. A copper compound created the brilliant blues that still startle visitors to the reconstructed portions of Knossos. Black came from carbonized materials. These weren't just decorative choices. The vivid colors transformed stone corridors into spaces that felt alive, connected to the natural world even when deep inside multi-story palace complexes. Centuries passed, and the Minoan civilization faded into memory. But the technique of fresco painting continued and evolved. When Roman culture spread across the Mediterranean, wealthy citizens wanted their homes adorned with paintings, and fresco became the preferred method for decorating interior walls. In the first century of the Common Era, in prosperous Roman cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum near the Bay of Naples, fresco painting reached new heights of sophistication and variety. Roman painters created elaborate decorative schemes that transformed windowless interior rooms into spaces that seemed to open onto gardens, colonnades, and distant landscapes. They understood how to use painting to trick the eye, creating architectural details that appeared three-dimensional on flat walls. Columns seemed to project forward. Windows appeared to open onto terraces overlooking the sea. Gardens filled with fruit trees and singing birds stretched back into impossible depths. Scholars today call these different approaches the four styles of Roman wall painting, tracking how techniques and fashions evolved over the decades. The subjects Roman painters chose reveal what these ancient people valued and enjoyed. Mythological scenes were popular, showing stories from Greek legends that educated Romans knew well. Gods and heroes moved through these painted narratives with grace and drama. But Romans also wanted images from everyday life. We can see painted still life showing tables laden with fruit and bread, glass vessels and silver plates. Some homes had paintings of garden landscapes, creating the illusion that rooms opened directly onto nature. Others featured scenes of daily activities, people in markets or festival. One remarkable series of paintings found in the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii shows life-sized figures engaged in what appears to be a religious ceremony. The figures move along the walls in a continuous frieze, and their poses and expressions suggest intense emotion and spiritual significance. The deep red background, now called Pompeian red, sets off the figures dramatically. We can still see the subtle modeling of their forms, the careful attention to how fabric drapes and folds, and the way the painter captured different emotional states through gesture and expression. The fresco painters of Pompeii and Herculaneum worked with increasing refinement. They learned to create smooth, polished plaster surfaces that could accommodate very fine detail. They developed the ability to show light and shadow convincingly, making their painted figures appear to have real volume and weight. Some painters specialized in particular subjects. We know from ancient writers that certain artists became famous for their ability to paint architecture, while others were sought after for figures or landscapes. Then, in the year 79 of the Common Era, Mount Vesuvius erupted with catastrophic force. A cloud of superheated gas, ash, and pumice raced down the mountainside and engulfed the nearby cities. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum had little warning and no chance to escape. The tragedy that befell these cities was complete and sudden. Yet this same disaster, terrible as it was, created an extraordinary accident of preservation. The volcanic material that buried the cities sealed them away from air and moisture. where Roman paintings in other cities faded and flaked away over the following centuries. The frescoes of Pompeii and Herculaneum remain protected beneath layers of ash and hardened mud. When excavations began in the 18th century, workers uncovered rooms with their painted decorations still intact, colors still vivid after 1700 years. It was as if time had stopped on that terrible day in autumn when the volcano exploded. These preserved paintings offer us an intimate window into Roman life and artistic achievement. We can walk through ancient rooms and see exactly what a wealthy Roman family saw on their walls each day. We can study the techniques the painters used, sometimes even seeing the marks where they sketched preliminary outlines in the wet plaster. We can trace how individual hands worked, recognizing the style of particular painters moving from room to room. The fresco technique itself required careful planning and teamwork. First, workers prepared the wall with multiple layers of plaster, each one smoother and finer than the last. The final layer, which would receive the painting, was applied in sections small enough to be completed in a day's work. These sections, called giornate in Italian, are sometimes still visible where one day's work ended and the next began. The painter worked from the top of the wall downward to avoid dripping on finished work. Assistants ground pigments and mixed them with water. The master painter worked steadily, knowing the plaster would only remain workable for hours. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine standing in a Roman villa on a warm Mediterranean evening, the last light fading outside while oil lamps begin to glow inside. The painted walls around you seem to dissolve the boundaries of the room. A painted garden extends into twilight. Distant mountains fade into painted atmospheric haze. Birds perch in painted trees. The fresco painter has given you windows that need no glass, gardens that require no water, an expanded world captured in pigment and lime. This marriage of chemistry and art, of technical mastery and creative vision, would continue to inspire painters for thousands of years to come. As we leave behind the preserved frescoes of the Mediterranean world, our journey now carries us eastward, across vast distances to lands where entirely different philosophies would shape the art of painting. While Roman artists worked their pigments into wet plaster on villa walls, painters in ancient China and India were developing approaches to image making that reflected profoundly different ways of understanding the relationship between humanity, nature, and the spiritual realm. In China, the origins of painting stretch back thousands of years, though the earliest examples have been lost to time's patient erosion. What we do know is that by the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, Chinese artists had already established traditions that would influence painting for millennia to come. Unlike the wall-focused Mediterranean painters, Chinese artists discovered the remarkable properties of silk as a painting surface. This delicate fabric, produced through the careful cultivation of silkworms and already prized for clothing and trade, offered a smooth, portable surface that could hold ink and color with extraordinary subtlety. The materials themselves carried meaning. Chinese painters worked primarily with ink made from pine soot or lampblack, carefully mixed with animal glue and formed into solid sticks. When needed, The artist would grind the ink stick on a stone with water, creating liquid ink of varying intensity. This simple palette of black ink and water could produce an astonishing range of tones, from the palest whisper of grey to the deepest, most saturated black. The brush, typically made from animal hair bound to a bamboo handle, became an extension of the painter's very breath and energy. What made Chinese painting distinctive was not merely its materials, but the philosophical foundations beneath every brushstroke. Taoist thought, with its emphasis on harmony with nature and the underlying energy flowing through all things, profoundly influenced how Chinese painters approached their subjects. Rather than attempting to capture every detail of a landscape's appearance, the Chinese painter sought to express its essential spirit, its qi or life force. A mountain was not merely a geological formation to be recorded, but a presence embodying permanence and dignity. Water was not simply H2O, but the principle of yielding strength, always finding its path. This philosophical approach meant that Chinese landscape painting, which would become one of the tradition's highest achievements, looked remarkably different from Western landscapes developed centuries later. Chinese painters often left large areas of silk unpainted, allowing the blank space to suggest mist, sky, or the void from which all things emerge. Mountains might tower at the top of a composition with vast emptiness below, defying the Western impulse to anchor landscapes along a ground line. Human figures, when they appeared at all, were often tiny presences dwarfed by nature's grandeur, reflecting humanity's humble place within the greater cosmos. The act of painting itself became a meditative practice. Chinese artists spent years mastering basic brushstrokes, practicing the controlled movement that would allow a line to swell and taper with calligraphic grace. There could be no correction, no painting over, no second chance. Each stroke was laid down with commitment and presence, capturing not just an image, but the artist's state of mind and spiritual cultivation at that precise moment. This is why Chinese painting and calligraphy were considered sister arts, both requiring the same mastery of breath, brush, and inner stillness. Meanwhile, in India, painting developed along parallel yet distinct lines, deeply intertwined with spiritual practice. The earliest surviving Indian paintings are found in cave sanctuaries, particularly the remarkable Buddhist caves at Ajanta, carved into a horseshoe-shaped cliff in the western region of Maharashtra. Beginning around the 2nd century BCE and continuing for several centuries, these caves were adorned with paintings that served religious and educational purposes for the monks who lived and meditated within. The Ajanta paintings depict scenes from the Buddha's life and previous incarnations, known as jatakas. Working on the rough rock surfaces, artists first applied a coating of clay, cow dung, and rice husks to create a smooth ground, then added a finer layer of lime plaster. Upon this prepared surface, they painted with mineral and vegetable pigments, creating rich earth reds, warm ochres, deep blacks from lamp black, and precious blues from lapis lazuli, imported from distant Afghanistan. What strikes observers about these ancient Indian paintings is their fluid grace and the gentle expressions on depicted faces. Figures move with elegant curves, their bodies rendered with volumetric shading, that creates a sense of three-dimensional form emerging from the wall. Unlike the flat, profile views of Egyptian painting we explored earlier, Indian artists showed figures in three-quarter view and even from behind, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of form and space. The Buddha himself appears with serene compassion, his features idealized according to traditional iconography, his presence radiating calm wisdom that still touches visitors to these caves today. The purposes of painting in India extended beyond mere decoration. These images served as visual scriptures for teaching Buddhist principles to those who could not read sacred texts. They created environments conducive to meditation and spiritual contemplation. The very act of creating such paintings was considered a devotional practice, an offering of beauty and skill in service of enlightenment. As Buddhism spread from India along the Silk Road trade routes, this painting tradition traveled with it, adapting to each culture it encountered. In China, Buddhist themes merged with existing artistic traditions, creating synthesis between Indian volumetric modeling and Chinese linear grace. Cave temples at Dunhuang, an oasis town on the Silk Road, preserve thousands of painted Buddhist images spanning many centuries, each showing the evolving conversation between cultures as techniques and styles passed back and forth along those ancient trade routes. Both Chinese and Indian painting traditions shared something that distinguished them from the Mediterranean approaches we examined earlier. In both cultures, painting was inseparable from spiritual practice and philosophical understanding. The painter was not merely recording visual appearance, but attempting to capture something beyond the visible, whether the vital energy flowing through a landscape or the transcendent wisdom of enlightened beings. The materials themselves, the silk and ink, the mineral pigments ground from semi-precious stones, were chosen and prepared with reverence. As we drift now towards sleep, we might imagine the patient monk grinding his ink stick on stone, the soft sound of bristles on silk, the vast quiet of mountain mists rendered in subtle gradations of grey. We might picture the artist in an Indian cave, working by lamplight to paint the gentle smile of compassion on a bodhisattva's face, offering this gift of beauty to all beings seeking peace. These Eastern traditions established approaches to painting that would continue unbroken for thousands of years, even as Western art moved through transformation after transformation. The conversation between these different visions of what painting could be would wait many centuries before genuine exchange began. But that meeting between East and West lies ahead in our story. For now, we rest with these early achievements, with silk and stone, with ink and devotion, with the quiet wisdom of paintings created not for fame or wealth, but for harmony with something greater than ourselves. As the great Eastern traditions of ink and silk painting flourished across Asia, another distinctive approach to painted images emerged along the shores of the Mediterranean and beyond. In the territories that had once formed the eastern half of the Roman Empire, a new civilization was taking shape, one that would develop its own remarkable vision of what painting could be and what purpose it might serve. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, inherited the artistic traditions of Rome, but transformed them into something entirely new. Beginning in the 4th century, and continuing for more than 1,000 years. Byzantine painters created works that seem to exist outside of ordinary time and space. These were not attempts to capture the visible world as it appeared to the eye, but rather efforts to make visible something that lay beyond the physical realm entirely. The paintings we now call icons became the heart of Byzantine artistic expression. The word itself comes from the Greek icon, meaning image, but these were far more than simple pictures. Byzantine Christians believed that certain images possessed a special power to connect the earthly world with the divine. An icon of Christ or the Virgin Mary or a beloved saint was understood as a kind of window, a place where the boundary between heaven and earth became thin and permeable. This spiritual understanding profoundly shaped how Byzantine painters approached their craft. Unlike the Roman frescoes of Pompeii, with their illusion of three-dimensional space and naturalistic figures, Byzantine icons deliberately flattened space and stylized their subjects. The backgrounds glowed with sheets of gold leaf, eliminating any sense of a particular place or time. Figures faced forward, their eyes gazing directly at the viewer with an intensity that seemed to look into the soul itself. The technique Byzantine painters used required patience and precision. Most icons were painted on wooden panels, typically made from sturdy woods that could last for centuries. The wood was carefully prepared, covered with layers of gesso, a mixture of chalk or gypsum and glue that created a smooth, bright white surface for painting. Then came the gold, applied as delicate sheets of gold leaf that were gently pressed onto areas treated with a special adhesive. The burnishing of the gold was an art unto itself, as craftsmen rubbed the surface with smooth stones or wolves' teeth until it gleamed with an otherworldly radiance. This wasn't the gold of earthly wealth, but something meant to evoke divine light itself, the uncreated light that Byzantine theologians believed surrounded the presence of God. For the painting itself, Byzantine artists used egg tempera, mixing their pigments with egg yolk to create paint that dried quickly to a matte, luminous finish. The process required building up colors gradually in thin layers, each one modifying the appearance of those beneath. Faces were created through a careful sequence of steps that remained remarkably consistent across centuries. First came dark base layers of green or brown earth tones, establishing shadows and structure. Then lighter flesh tones were carefully applied, leaving the dark undertones visible in shadows around eyes and nose and mouth. Finally, thin lines of highlighting caught the light on cheeks and forehead and nose, creating an effect that made faces seem to emerge from shadow into illumination. The colors Byzantine painters chose carried symbolic weight. Deep blues made from expensive lapis lazuli often clothed the Virgin Mary, signifying heaven and purity. Rich reds spoke of divine love and sacrifice. White represented holiness and transfiguration. Even the arrangement of colors and the gestures of painted hands followed established conventions that viewers learned to read like a visual language. The style of Byzantine painting remained remarkably stable over centuries, while Western European art would go through dramatic changes in style and approach. Byzantine icons maintained their essential characteristics from the 6th century through the 14th and beyond. This consistency was not due to lack of skill or imagination, but rather reflected the icon's spiritual purpose. These images were not meant to showcase individual artistic creativity, but to faithfully transmit sacred truths. Innovation for its own sake would have seemed not just unnecessary, but potentially dangerous, risking the corruption of images that served such vital spiritual functions. Painters of icons worked within established patterns and proportions that had been handed down through generations. Young artists learned by copying the works of masters, absorbing not just techniques, but the spiritual discipline their craft required. Many icon painters were monks who approached their work as a form of prayer, preparing themselves through fasting and devotion before picking up their brushes. The faces that gazed from these icons possessed a distinctive beauty, neither fully realistic nor completely abstract. Noses were long and slender, eyes large and deeply expressive, mouths small and serious. Bodies existed beneath flowing robes, but without the weight and substance that Giotto would later bring to painted figures. These were not portraits of individuals as they might have appeared walking down a street in Constantinople, but rather visions of humanity transfigured, freed from the limitations of flesh and time. Icons were created not just for churches, but for homes, for travelers, for soldiers heading into conflict. Small portable icons could be carried as protection and comfort. Larger icons occupied places of honor in churches, where worshippers would light candles before them, kiss their surfaces, and direct prayers through them toward the divine beings they represented. The paintings became marked by the devotion of centuries, their surfaces darkened by smoke from countless candles, worn smooth by the lips of the faithful. The influence of Byzantine painting spread far beyond the empire's political borders. Through trade and conquest, through missionaries and diplomatic gifts, the Byzantine approach to sacred images reached across Eastern Europe and into Russia. When Christianity came to the Slavic lands, it brought with it the tradition of icon painting, which would flourish in Russian monasteries and churches long after Constantinople itself had fallen to conquest. Even as the medieval period unfolded in Western Europe, with its own developing traditions of manuscript illumination and altarpiece painting, the Byzantine approach remained distinct. Where Western artists would increasingly pursue naturalism and spatial depth, Byzantine painters held fast to their symbolic vocabulary of gold and stylized form. Both traditions created works of profound beauty and spiritual power, but they chose different paths toward expressing the sacred through painted images. The gold-backed icons, with their solemn faces and eternal gaze, represented one answer to the fundamental question of what painting might be and do. In the Byzantine understanding, the painter's highest calling was not to imitate the visible world, but to create openings through which the invisible might become present, if only for a moment, to those who looked with eyes of faith. As the Byzantine world continued its traditions in the East, Western Europe entered a period we often call the Middle Ages, where painting found refuge and purpose in two distinctive realms: the quiet scriptoria of monasteries and the soaring churches that reached toward heaven. These were centuries when the art of painting adapted, survived, and quietly prepared for transformation. In monasteries scattered across Europe, from Ireland to Italy, monks bent over tables in rooms called scriptoria, their shoulders curved as they worked with infinite patience on sheets of parchment. These were the illuminators, and their canvases were the pages of manuscripts, primarily religious texts that needed to be copied by hand, one letter at a time. But these books were not merely copied. They were transformed into objects of breathtaking beauty through painted decoration. The term illuminated referred to the way gold and silver leaf seemed to make the pages glow, as if lit from within. A monk might spend an entire day painting a single elaborate initial letter at the beginning of a chapter, surrounding it with vines, flowers, birds, and sometimes fantastical creatures that existed nowhere in nature. The margins became gardens of imagination, where saints gazed serenely from golden backgrounds. Biblical scenes unfolded in miniature, and decorative borders twisted into intricate patterns. These illuminators worked with tools as delicate as their craft required. Brushes made from just a few hairs, sometimes from squirrel tails, allowed them to paint details so fine they can scarcely be seen without magnification. Their pigments came from minerals ground to powder, from plants, and sometimes from ingredients that had traveled remarkable distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan created the precious ultramarine blue. Cochineal insects from the Mediterranean provided brilliant reds. Gold was hammered into leaves so thin they could float on breath. The work demanded not just artistic skill, but profound patience. A single manuscript might take months or even years to complete. The Book of Kells, created by Irish monks around the year 800, contains such intricate decoration that modern viewers struggle to comprehend how human hands could achieve such precision. Every page presents a tapestry of interlaced patterns, stylized figures, and details that reveal new surprises with each viewing. As centuries progressed, manuscript illumination evolved. By the Gothic period, in the 13th and 14th centuries, the style had become more naturalistic, though still constrained by the small scale. Books of hours, prayer books for wealthy patrons, became showcases for artistic innovation. Artists began to show real landscapes in the background, captured the fall of fabric with greater observation, and depicted the months of the year with scenes from contemporary life, giving us invaluable glimpses into medieval daily existence. While monks painted in their quiet rooms, another form of painting was transforming the walls and altars of churches. The altarpiece became a central focus of religious devotion and artistic ambition. These were painted panels, sometimes single, sometimes multiple panels, joined by hinges, that stood behind and above the altar, where the Mass was celebrated. Early medieval altarpieces continued in the Byzantine tradition, with figures presented frontally against gold backgrounds, their faces serene and otherworldly. But in Italy, particularly in the 13th century, painters began to explore subtle changes. The rigid conventions started to soften. Faces began to show traces of individual emotion. Bodies, while still stylized, suggested weight and presence. Lucio di Buoninsegna, working in Siena in the late 1300s, created altarpieces that maintained the golden splendor of Byzantine art while introducing a new tenderness. His figures still inhabited a celestial realm of gold, but their poses showed grace. Their faces expressed gentle emotion, and their interactions with one another suggested genuine relationships. His Maestà, painted for Siena's cathedral, was carried through the streets in triumph when completed, a testament to how deeply communities valued these works. In nearby Florence, Cimabue was pushing in similar directions. His large altarpieces showed the Virgin Mary enthroned in majesty, surrounded by angels and saints, all against the mandatory gold background that signified the divine realm. But Cimabue's figures had substance. The Virgin's throne appeared to occupy space. The angels clustered around it in arrangements that suggested depth, even if that depth was not rendered with mathematical precision. These painters were still working primarily in tempera, the medium they had inherited from Byzantine tradition. Egg yolk mixed with pigment created colors that dried quickly to a matte finish. Artists built up forms through careful layering, using fine parallel strokes called hatching to create the illusion of modeling and shadow. The technique required meticulous planning, as changes were difficult once the paint had dried. The subjects of these altarpieces were overwhelmingly religious, drawn from biblical narratives and the lives of saints. The crucifixion, the Virgin and Child, the lives of patron saints of particular churches. These scenes were painted again and again, each artist working within established traditions while bringing their own sensibilities to eternal themes. Gothic painting, which flourished from the 12th through 14th centuries, developed its own distinctive character. Figures became more elegant, with elongated proportions and graceful curves that echoed the soaring arches of Gothic architecture. The International Gothic style, which spread across Europe in the 1400s, took this elegance to new heights of refinement, with richly dressed figures posed in gardens and palaces, painted with exquisite attention to decorative detail. Yet even within these conventions, individual painters were making discoveries. Simone Martini, another Sienese master, painted with a linear grace and delicacy of color that influenced artists far beyond Italy. His figures seemed to float, weightless and refined, yet their faces showed distinct personalities and moods. In Northern Europe, manuscript illumination was developing its own innovations. The Limbourg brothers, working in France in the early 1500s, created the Très Riche Heure for the Duke of Berry, a book of hours that stands as one of medieval painting's supreme achievements. Their calendar pages show the months of the year with unprecedented realism in depicting landscape, architecture, and the activities of both nobles and peasants. The deep blue skies, the detailed castles, the careful observation of seasonal change. All of this pointed toward a new interest in representing the visible world with faithful attention. These centuries of medieval painting might seem like a slow interlude between the glories of ancient art and the explosion of the Renaissance. But they were essential years of preservation and subtle development. Techniques were perfected. New materials were tested. Most importantly, artists were gradually pushing against the boundaries of convention, trying to breathe more life, more humanity into their painted figures. The stage was being set, the tools prepared, for artists who would soon take these incremental changes and transform them into revolution. But on this quiet evening, we can simply appreciate the gentle devotion of those monks bent over their manuscripts, the careful brushstrokes of painters covering wooden panels with sacred stories, all working in the conviction that their art served purposes larger than themselves. In the small Tuscan town of Colle di Valdo, around the year 1267, a boy was born who would change the course of Western art forever. His name was Ambrogio di Bondone, though history would remember him simply as Giotto. In an age when painting remained bound by centuries of Byzantine convention, when figures floated against golden backgrounds with wide, unchanging eyes, this shepherd's son would teach painted people to stand on solid ground, to occupy real space, and to express genuine human emotion. The Florence of Giotto's youth was a city awakening to new possibilities. Merchants grew wealthy through banking and the wool trade. Thinkers were beginning to question ancient authorities and observe the world with fresh eyes. The poet Dante walked those same streets, crafting verses that would establish Italian as a literary language. In this atmosphere of emerging humanism, the moment was approaching when someone would look at painting's flat, symbolic traditions and ask a revolutionary question: what if we painted people as they actually appear? According to the stories that circulated even during his lifetime, the painter Cimabue discovered young Giotto drawing sheep on a rock while tending his father's flock. Whether this charming tale holds truth or merely reflects the Renaissance love of dramatic artist origin stories, we cannot know with certainty. What remains undeniable is that Giotto trained in Florence during the late 1200s and absorbed the incremental changes that painters like Cimabue were already introducing. Subtle attempts to give figures slightly more volume, to suggest the weight of drapery, to capture more naturalistic poses. But Giotto would go much further. When he received the commission to paint the life of St. Francis in the Upper Basilica at Assisi, likely in the 1290s, he approached the task with an entirely new vision. Rather than presenting the saint as a flat, iconic figure against a timeless golden void, Giotto placed Francis in architectural spaces that obeyed logical perspective principles. Buildings had corners that receded into depth. Figures stood before these structures in believable scale. The scenes possessed a quality that Byzantine painting had deliberately avoided for centuries. They looked like moments that might actually have occurred in real places. Consider one of the most famous of these frescoes, where St. Francis preaches to the birds. Earlier painters would have arranged the elements symbolically, with the saint and birds floating in an abstract composition that prioritized spiritual meaning over physical reality. Giotto instead shows Francis standing on solid earth, his body turning in three-dimensional space beneath robes that fall with natural weight. The birds gather before him in a landscape with trees and hills extending backward. We can sense the saint's gentle presence, the attentive curiosity of the birds, the specific quality of this encounter. The painting tells us both that something spiritually significant is happening, and that it happens in the real world where bodies have mass and moments unfold in particular places. Giotto worked in the demanding medium of fresco, painting on fresh, wet plaster that would dry to seal the pigments permanently into the wall. This technique required certainty and speed. An artist had to complete each section while the plaster remained workable, usually within a single day. Corrections were difficult, yet Fresco's demands seemed to suit Giotto's bold, confident style. He built his figures with broad modeling of light and shadow, giving faces and bodies a sculptural solidity that made them appear to project forward from the wall's surface. His greatest achievement awaited in Padua, where around 1305, the wealthy banker Enrico Scrivani commissioned Giotto to paint the entire interior of a private chapel. The Arena Chapel, as it came to be called, provided Giotto with an unprecedented opportunity, complete control over a unified pictorial space where he could develop his narrative abilities across dozens of interconnected scenes. Walking into the Arena Chapel, even today, visitors encounter a revolutionary vision of storytelling through paint. Giotto covered the walls with scenes from the lives of Mary and Christ, arranged in horizontal registers that guide the eye through the unfolding narrative. Each scene occupies its own architectural frame, yet subtle connections of gesture, color, and composition link them into a flowing visual sequence. The brilliant blue ceiling, painted with gold stars, arches overhead like the vault of heaven itself. What strikes viewers most powerfully is the emotional reality Giotto achieved. In the scene of Joachim returning to the sheepfold after learning his wife is pregnant with Mary, we see genuine joy and wonder in the faces of the shepherds. When Mary visits Elizabeth, the two women embrace with tender affection, their bodies pressing together in a way that suggests real physical presence and emotional connection. In the lamentation over Christ's dead body, the figures gather with such palpable grief. Mary cradling her son's head, mourners bending forward in despair, angels wheeling overhead in anguish. That viewers across 7 centuries have found themselves moved by the raw humanity of the moment. Giotto understood that meaningful religious art need not abandon earthly reality to access spiritual truth. Instead, by making sacred figures recognizably human, capable of doubt, fear, love, and sorrow, he made their stories more powerful, more immediate, more capable of touching viewers' hearts. His people have weight and occupy space, not because he rejected the spiritual dimension of religious painting, but because he grasped that embodied emotional reality could convey spiritual meaning more effectively than stylized abstraction. The innovations extended beyond emotional expression to the very structure of pictorial space. Giotto arranged his compositions with an intuitive understanding of how to create depth, even though the mathematical systems of linear perspective would not be fully articulated for another century. His architectural settings recede convincingly. His figures stand in believable relationships to one another and their surroundings. His drapery falls in heavy folds that reveal the bodies beneath. Light appears to come from consistent sources, modeling forms with shadow and highlight. Contemporary observers recognized immediately that something unprecedented was occurring. The poet Dante, Giotto's fellow Florentine, mentioned him in the Divine Comedy as having surpassed his master Cimabue. The writer Boccaccio later praised Giotto for bringing back to light an art that had been buried for centuries. These weren't merely polite compliments to a successful painter. They reflected genuine awareness that Giotto had fundamentally redirected the course of Western painting. Other artists took notice. Throughout the 14th century, painters across Italy absorbed and developed Giotto's innovations. The tradition that would come to be known as the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical naturalism combined with Christian subject matter, found its essential foundation in this painter's revolutionary vision. When artists a century later would develop mathematical perspective, study anatomy systematically, and push naturalism even further, they built on ground that Giotto had prepared. In the quiet of evening, as light fades and the day's concerns begin to settle, we might reflect on this painter who saw differently, who looked at the flat, golden conventions he inherited and dared to imagine something new. In those plastered chapel walls in Assisi and Padua, covered with scenes of ancient stories, Giotto opened a door through which Western painting would pass into new territory, a world where art could be both spiritually meaningful and emotionally true, both transcendent and recognizably human. The journey toward capturing reality on painted surfaces had taken a decisive turn, and the path ahead would lead to wonders Giotto himself could scarcely have imagined. As the innovations of Giotto spread across Italy through the 14th century, something quite different was happening far to the north. In the prosperous cities of Flanders and the Netherlands, painters were developing their own revolutionary approach to capturing the world on panel and canvas, while Italian artists pursued the mathematical perfection of perspective and the idealized forms of classical antiquity. The painters of the north were becoming fascinated with something else entirely: the minute, faithful recording of every surface, every texture, every reflection of light on the physical world around them. The climate of the Low Countries was different from sunny Italy. The light there was softer, more diffused, filtered through frequent clouds and mist. The landscape was flat, marked by canals and waterways, by prosperous merchant cities rather than hilltop towns. The wealth of the region came not from ancient glory, but from trade, from wool and cloth, from the merchant class rather than princely courts. All of this shaped how northern artists saw and represented their world. The greatest revolution they brought to painting was technical rather than theoretical. Somewhere around the year 1420, painters in Bruges and Ghent began perfecting a new medium that would transform the art of painting forever: oil paint. The story has often been told that Jan van Eyck invented oil painting, but like many such stories, the truth is more gradual and complex. Painters had experimented with oils before, mixing pigments with various drying oils like linseed and walnut. But it was Van Eyck and his contemporaries who refined the technique to such a degree that it became the preferred medium for serious painting. The advantages of oil paint over the egg tempera that had dominated medieval and early Renaissance painting were numerous and significant. Tempera dried quickly, which meant painters had to work rapidly in small sections. The colors, while beautiful, had a certain flatness to them. Oil paint, by contrast, dried slowly, allowing the artist to blend colors smoothly on the painting surface itself, creating subtle gradations of tone that were impossible with tempera. The slow drying time meant an artist could work and rework a passage, correcting and refining. Most importantly, oil paint could be applied in thin, translucent layers called glazes. By building up multiple layers, each slightly different in tone or color, painters could achieve effects of extraordinary luminosity and depth. Jan van Eyck understood these possibilities better than anyone. His Ghent altarpiece, completed in 1432 with his brother Hubert, demonstrates a level of detail and finish that must have seemed miraculous to contemporary viewers. Every jewel on a crown catches light differently. Every thread in a brocade fabric is visible. The folds of velvet have weight and depth. Distant landscapes recede into atmospheric haze with convincing subtlety. This was a different kind of realism than Giotto had achieved, where the Italian master had captured the solid, sculptural weight of human bodies and the authentic emotions of human experience. Van Eyck captured the precise appearance of surfaces and materials with almost obsessive fidelity. His Arnolfini portrait, painted in 1434, shows this mastery in an intimate setting. A wealthy merchant and his wife stand in their home, surrounded by objects that speak of prosperity and domestic life. But what makes the painting extraordinary is how Van Eyck has rendered each element. The fur trim on the garments looks genuinely soft. The wooden floor reflects light from the window. Most famously, a small convex mirror on the back wall reflects the entire room, including tiny figures that must be Van Eyck himself and an assistant, witnesses to the scene. It is a tour de force of observational painting, each element recorded with meticulous care. This northern attention to detail extended beyond technical virtuosity. There was a philosophical dimension to it as well. In the religious culture of the North, the divine could be found in all things, not just in idealized human forms. A landscape, a flower, a domestic interior, each contained reflections of divine creation. Therefore, each deserved the same careful attention. This helps explain why Northern painting developed strong traditions in genres that Italian art considered less important. Landscape, still life, scenes of everyday life. Rogier van der Weyden, another Flemish master of the 15th century, combined this precise oil technique with deep emotional expression. His Descent from the Cross shows figures compressed into a shallow space like a carved altarpiece, but rendered with the full color and detail that oil painting allowed. The grief of the mourners is palpable, their tears and anguish captured with the same careful observation Van Eyck applied to jewels and fabrics. The crimson of the robes glows with an intensity that tempera could never achieve. The oil painting technique spread gradually through Northern Europe. In Germany, painters like Stefan Lochner combined the new medium with older Gothic traditions of graceful, decorative line. The results had a jewel-like quality, colors glowing against gold backgrounds in ways that married old and new approaches. What Northern painters seemed less concerned with was the mathematical perspective that was becoming central to Italian art. Their spaces often appear more intuitive than systematic, constructed through careful observation rather than geometric theory. Buildings and interiors recede convincingly enough, but not according to the strict vanishing points Italian theorists were codifying. The Northern eye was more interested in how things actually appeared than in the abstract principles underlying that appearance. This difference in approach extended to human figures as well. Northern painters were less interested in the idealized classical proportions Italian artists derived from ancient sculpture. They painted people as they looked, with all the individuality and imperfection of actual human beings. The faces in Van Eyck's paintings are portraits of specific people, not idealized types. This gave Northern painting a particular quality of intimacy and humanity, a sense of the real world observed closely and honestly. The trade networks that made Flanders wealthy also spread the influence of its painting technique. Italian merchants and bankers working in Bruges encountered these luminous oil paintings and brought word of them south. Some northern paintings made their way to Italy. Italian painters began to notice the qualities oil paint could achieve. Gradually, over the course of the 15th century, oil painting would be adopted in Italy as well, though it would take decades before southern painters truly mastered the medium the northerners had pioneered. As midnight deepens and we consider these northern masters at their work, we might imagine the light in a Bruges workshop. Northern sun filtering through glass windows, illuminating the careful hand-mixing pigments with oil, building up layer after layer on a wooden panel. The technique required patience and precision, but the results were paintings that seemed to hold light within them, that preserved every detail of the visible world with reverent care. The Northern Renaissance had its own vision, its own genius, and in the hands of painters like Van Eyck, it achieved a perfection equal to but different from the Italian achievements we have traced. Both traditions would continue to develop, and eventually they would flow together, each learning from the other, creating the rich tradition of European painting that would shape the art for centuries to come. While painters in Flanders and the Netherlands were perfecting the luminous possibilities of oil paint, Italian artists were pursuing a different kind of revolution. They were wrestling with a problem that had challenged painters since ancient times: how to create the convincing illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. The solution they discovered would change not just painting, but the entire way humans visualized and understood their world. For centuries, painters had suggested depth through various intuitive methods. They placed distant objects higher in the composition, made faraway things smaller, and overlapped forms to show which was in front. Byzantine artists created shimmering golden spaces that seemed to exist outside normal reality. Medieval painters stacked their figures in registers, creating narrative clarity, but not spatial depth. Even Giotto's revolutionary weight and volume existed in relatively shallow spaces, like actors performing on a stage with limited depth. What was missing was a systematic mathematical method for creating the illusion that a viewer could step into the painted world and measure the distances between objects as they existed in real space. The breakthrough came not from a painter, but from an architect. Filippo Brunelleschi, the brilliant mind behind Florence's magnificent cathedral dome, conducted a series of experiments around 1420 in the Piazza del Duomo. He painted a view of the baptistry of San Giovanni on a small wooden panel, then drilled a small hole through the painting at the vanishing point. Standing at the entrance to the cathedral, Brunelleschi held the panel at arm's length, with the painted side facing away from him. He positioned a mirror in front of the painting and looked through the hole from behind, seeing the painted image reflected back. When he moved the mirror away, the actual baptistry appeared in the same spot. The painted illusion and reality aligned so perfectly that observers could barely distinguish between the two. What Brunelleschi had discovered was linear perspective, a mathematical system based on geometry and optics. He recognized that parallel lines moving away from the viewer appear to converge at a single point on the horizon, which he called the vanishing point. This wasn't just artistic intuition, but geometric truth, capable of being measured, calculated, and taught. For the first time, space itself could be rationally organized according to mathematical principles. The architect and scholar Leon Battista Alberti transformed these practical experiments into theory. In 1435, he wrote a treatise called De Pictura, or On Painting, which explained the principles of perspective in clear, systematic terms. Alberti described painting as an open window through which the viewer looks at the world. He explained how to establish a horizon line at the viewer's eye level, how to determine a central vanishing point, and how to construct a checkerboard floor that receded convincingly into depth. This grid became the framework upon which everything else in the painting could be accurately positioned. Distance could now be measured, proportions calculated, and spatial relationships rendered with mathematical precision. Painters seized upon these discoveries with tremendous excitement. The young Masaccio became the first painter to fully integrate Brunelleschi's perspective into narrative painting. In his fresco of the Holy Trinity in the church of Santa Maria Novella, painted around 1427, Masaccio created an architectural space so convincing that it seems to carve a chapel into the flat wall. The barrel-vaulted ceiling recedes with perfect accuracy. Every line converges correctly toward the vanishing point. The figures occupy this space with weight and solidity, standing on a floor that appears to extend beneath them. Viewers standing before the fresco experience the unsettling sensation that they could walk into this painted chamber. The impact on those who first witnessed this achievement can hardly be overstated. For the first time, a painted surface could create not just the suggestion of depth, but a measurable, rational space governed by the same geometric laws that structured the physical world. This was more than artistic technique. It was a new way of understanding vision itself and humanity's relationship to space. If space could be rationally organized and controlled, then humans had taken another step toward comprehending and mastering their world. Piero della Francesca became perhaps the greatest master of perspective's potential. This painter from the small town of San Sepolcro was equally gifted as a mathematician and artist. He wrote his own treatise on perspective and explored its possibilities with almost scientific rigor. In paintings like The Flagellation of Christ, created around 1460, Piero constructed spaces of crystalline clarity. The architectural setting is rendered with such geometric precision that scholars have been able to create accurate floor plans of his painted buildings. Every tile on the floor, every column and arch obeys perspective's laws perfectly. Yet Piero's genius lay not just in mathematical accuracy, but in how he used this structured space to create meaning. The mysterious composition places the main religious scene in the background, while three foreground figures, whose identity remains debated, dominate the space. The precise perspective draws attention to this puzzling relationship, making spatial organization itself part of the painting's enigmatic power. Paolo Uccello became so obsessed with perspective that, according to his biographer Vasari, he would stay up all night studying its intricacies, telling his wife that perspective was so sweet. In his famous battle scenes, Uccello applied perspective to complex forms like lances, fallen soldiers, and rearing horses, creating patterns of lines that converge with almost decorative precision. His investigations sometimes produced images that feel more like demonstrations of perspective's possibilities than naturalistic scenes. But his enthusiasm for this new tool was infectious. The discovery of linear perspective fundamentally altered compositional possibilities. Painters could now organize complex scenes with numerous figures at varying distances, all related to each other through measurable space. They could create architectural settings of any complexity, knowing that mathematical rules would ensure consistency. The viewer's position relative to the painted scene became fixed and important. The perspective was calculated for someone standing at a specific spot at a specific height. This implied a relationship between painting and viewer more direct and rational than ever before. These innovations aligned perfectly with broader Renaissance values. Just as humanist scholars were recovering and systematizing ancient knowledge, just as architects were applying mathematical principles to buildings, and as scientists were seeking rational explanations for natural phenomena, painters were bringing mathematical order to visual experience. Perspective represented the Renaissance belief that human reason could comprehend and represent the world through systematic observation and logical principles. As painters mastered these techniques, they began to use them with increasing subtlety and freedom. The obvious display of perspective's mechanics gave way to more natural-seeming spaces where the mathematical framework remained present, but less obtrusive. The tool that had begun as a geometric exercise became an intuitive part of compositional thinking, a language painters spoke fluently without conscious effort. The three-dimensional stage was now built, waiting for the actors who would populate the paintings of the High Renaissance with unprecedented drama and grace. The mathematical principles of perspective had been discovered, written down, and were now spreading through the workshops and studios of Italy. But nowhere did these new ideas take root more enthusiastically than in Florence, a prosperous city-state on the banks of the Arno River, where commerce, banking, and an appetite for beauty created the perfect conditions for artistic innovation to flourish. In the middle decades of the 15th century, Florence became a kind of laboratory for painting. The city's wealth came from textile production, banking operations that stretched across Europe, and trade networks that brought exotic goods and new ideas from distant lands. This prosperity created something relatively new in the history of art. A substantial class of patrons who competed with one another to commission the most beautiful, the most innovative, the most impressive works for their private chapels, family palaces, and public buildings. The Medici family stood at the center of this cultural transformation, beginning with Cosimo de' Medici, who controlled Florence's political life while technically remaining a private citizen. The family invested enormous resources in art, architecture, and learning. Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo, who would become known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, continued this tradition with even greater enthusiasm. The Medici commissioned works from the most talented painters available, but they also did something more subtle and far-reaching. They created an environment where artists could experiment, where intellectual discussions about art theory took place alongside the actual creation of paintings, and where painters began to be seen not as simple craftsmen, but as learned men whose work required both manual skill and intellectual sophistication. This changing status of the artist marked a significant shift from medieval attitudes. In earlier centuries, painters belonged to guilds alongside other craftspeople, and their work was valued much as any skilled trade might be. But in 15th century Florence, talented painters began to move in humanist circles, discussing philosophy and classical literature with scholars and poets. Some learned Latin and studied ancient texts. They were no longer just making things with their hands. They were creating works that embodied ideas, that demonstrated knowledge of geometry and anatomy, that required education and intellect to produce. Among the painters working in this stimulating environment, Sandro Botticelli created some of the most distinctive and recognizable images of the entire Renaissance. Born Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippeppi around 1445, Botticelli trained in the workshop of Fra Filippo Lippi, a former monk whose own paintings showed the influence of Masaccio's innovations from earlier in the century. From Lippi, Botticelli learned technical fundamentals, but he developed a highly personal style characterized by flowing linear rhythms, graceful figures, and a dreamlike quality that set his work apart from the more solidly sculptural approach of some contemporaries. Botticelli's painting, known as Primavera, created around 1480, demonstrates how far Florentine painting had evolved. The scene unfolds in a grove where multiple figures from classical mythology occupy a shallow space among orange trees. Venus stands in the center, while other figures, including the three Graces and the god Mercury, fill the composition with elegant dancing movements. The painting's meaning has been debated by scholars for centuries, but its visual poetry is unmistakable. Botticelli used tempera on panel, a traditional medium, but his handling of line and form reflects purely Renaissance concerns with grace, beauty, and the revival of ancient themes. His even more famous Birth of Venus, painted a few years later, shows the goddess emerging from the sea on a shell, blown toward shore by wind gods, while a figure waits with a flowered cloak. The painting draws directly on descriptions of lost ancient artworks and treats a pagan mythological subject with utter seriousness and beauty. The goddess's pose echoes classical sculptures, demonstrating how painters now studied ancient art as carefully as they observed nature. Yet Botticelli's Venus has an otherworldly quality, her elongated proportions and wistful expression, creating something neither strictly realistic nor abstractly medieval, but distinctly his own. Another painter contributing to Florence's artistic richness was Paolo Uccello, whose very name reflected his obsession. Uccello means bird in Italian, and contemporaries noted his love of painting birds and animals. But Uccello's greater passion was perspective. According to the Renaissance biographer Vasari, Uccello spent nights working on perspective problems, and when his wife called him to bed, he would repeat that perspective was his mistress. His painting of the Battle of San Romano, created around 1438 to 1440, shows this obsession clearly. Fallen soldiers and broken lances lie arranged on the ground in careful perspective patterns, almost like demonstrations of geometric principles, while the battle itself unfolds with a somewhat static, decorative quality that makes the whole scene feel like a magnificently complex puzzle. Fra Filippo Lippi, Botticelli's teacher, deserves recognition in his own right as a painter who brought warmth and humanity to religious subjects. His Madonnas have a gentle, accessible beauty, quite different from the more remote sacred figures of earlier traditions. In works like his Madonna and Child with Two Angels, painted around 1465, the Virgin Mary seems like a real young woman, thoughtful and tender, painted with delicate attention to the translucent veil over her hair and the soft modeling of her face. The Christ child appears as an actual baby might appear, and the angels attending them have the faces of real Florentine children. This approachability in religious painting reflected the devotional practices of the time, which emphasized personal, emotional connections to sacred figures. The Pollaiuolo brothers, Antonio and Piero brought yet another emphasis to Florentine painting: the study of anatomy and the human body in motion. Antonio was particularly interested in how muscles worked beneath the skin, how the body moved and twisted. His paintings and prints of figures fighting, dancing, or straining with effort showed bodies understood from the inside out, muscles correctly rendered beneath the surface. This attention to anatomical accuracy became increasingly important in Florentine art, with painters sometimes observing dissections to understand bodily structure better. Domenico Ghirlandaio represented still another aspect of Florentine painting: the detailed recording of contemporary life within religious narratives. His frescoes in Santa Maria Novella, completed in the 1480s, depict biblical stories populated by recognizable Florentine citizens wearing contemporary clothing in settings that look like actual Florentine interiors. These paintings function almost as historical documents, showing us what prosperous Florentines wore, how their rooms were furnished, and how they styled their hair, all while nominally illustrating sacred histories. All these painters benefited from the workshop system that characterized Florentine art production. A successful master painter maintained a bottega, or workshop, where apprentices and assistants worked under his direction. Young boys might enter a workshop around age 10 or 12, learning to grind pigments, prepare panels, and gradually take on more sophisticated tasks. The master might design a composition and paint the most important parts himself, while trusted assistants completed backgrounds or secondary figures. This system allowed for considerable production, while also training the next generation of artists, creating a continuity of knowledge and an atmosphere where techniques could be refined and passed along. The paintings emerging from Florence in this period shared certain characteristics, even as individual masters developed personal styles. There was generally a clarity of form, a pleasure in linear design, and an interest in creating convincing three-dimensional space. Colors tended toward the clear and bright. Compositions usually had an underlying geometric order, even when depicting complex scenes. And increasingly, there was attention to ancient Roman art and literature as sources of both subjects and artistic principles. As the century progressed, Florence's artistic community had created works that transformed religious devotion, celebrated classical learning, and demonstrated that painting could be an intellectual pursuit worthy of the most refined minds. The stage was prepared for even greater achievements as the century drew toward its close, and painters of transcendent genius began their work. The Florence that had nurtured so many talented painters would witness the emergence of one whose genius seemed to transcend the very boundaries of human capability. Leonardo da Vinci arrived in this city of art and innovation as a young apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio around 1466, carrying with him an insatiable curiosity that would never diminish throughout his 67 years of life. In Verrocchio's busy studio, the young Leonardo learned the established techniques of tempera painting, the careful preparation of wooden panels, and the mixing of pigments. Yet even as an assistant, his exceptional abilities became apparent. When Verrocchio painted his Baptism of Christ, he assigned the young Leonardo to paint one of the angels. The story, passed down through generations, tells us that the angel Leonardo created was so beautiful, so alive with subtle grace, that Verrocchio himself recognized he had been surpassed by his student. Whether entirely true or embellished over time, this tale captures something essential about Leonardo's gift for breathing life into painted forms. What set Leonardo apart was not simply technical skill, though he possessed that in abundance. Rather, it was his conviction that painting required complete understanding of everything being depicted. To paint a human figure, he believed, one must understand anatomy with the precision of a physician. To paint landscapes, one must study geology, botany, and the behavior of light through atmosphere. To paint water, one must observe its movements, its currents and eddies, its reflections and refractions. This philosophy led him down endless paths of investigation, filling notebook after notebook with observations, sketches, and theories. His approach to painting itself became revolutionary. Working increasingly with oil paints rather than the tempera traditional in Florence, Leonardo developed a technique he called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke or vapor. This method involved building up countless thin, translucent layers of paint to create transitions so gradual that the eye could detect no lines or borders between light and shadow, between one form and another. The effect was a softness, an atmospheric quality that made his figures seem to exist in actual air rather than against flat backgrounds. We can observe this technique in what became perhaps the most famous portrait ever created, the painting we know as the Mona Lisa. Leonardo worked on this modest-sized panel intermittently for years, possibly from 1503 until near the end of his life. The identity of the sitter was most likely Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant, though Leonardo never delivered the finished work to whoever commissioned it. Instead, he kept it with him, refining and perfecting. The painting's fame rests partly on its technical mastery and partly on something more elusive. The subtle modeling of the face, created through sfumato, gives the features an extraordinary lifelikeness. The slight smile, built from the gentlest transitions of light and shadow, seems to shift as we look at it, present and then uncertain, knowing and then enigmatic. Behind the figure, Leonardo painted a landscape of rocks, water, and winding paths that seems both specific and dreamlike, positioned at different heights on either side to create a subtle dynamic tension in the composition. Leonardo's study of atmospheric perspective, which he also called aerial perspective, gave his landscapes particular depth and realism. He observed how distant objects appear not merely smaller, but also lighter in tone and bluer in color, due to the thickness of air between viewer and object. In the Mona Lisa's background, the far mountains fade into blue-grey mist, creating a convincing sense of vast distance behind the figure. His other surviving paintings, though few in number, each demonstrate different aspects of his innovative approach. The Virgin of the Rocks exists in two versions, one in Paris and one in London, showing his mastery of arranging figures in complex spatial relationships within a shadowy grotto setting. The soft light filtering through seems to emanate from the figures themselves, and the pointing gestures and exchanged glances create psychological connections between the subjects. The Last Supper, painted on the wall of a monastery dining hall in Milan between approximately 1495 and 1498, represented both a triumph and a frustration. Leonardo wished to work slowly, contemplating and revising, which was impossible with traditional fresco technique that required painting on wet plaster before it dried. So he experimented with a different method, essentially painting with tempera on dry plaster that he had prepared with a ground layer. This allowed him the time he needed, but the experimental technique soon began to deteriorate, and within decades the painting was already flaking and damaged. Despite this, and despite centuries of further deterioration and misguided restoration attempts, the composition's power remains evident. Leonardo arranged the 12 apostles in 4 groups of 3 along a table, with Christ isolated at the center. The moment depicted is Christ's announcement that one among them would betray him, and Leonardo captured each apostle's distinct reaction to this shocking statement. The perspective lines of the room's architecture converge on Christ's head, organizing the entire composition around this central figure. Windows behind Christ look out onto a landscape, bringing light and space into the scene. His anatomical studies went beyond what any artist before had attempted. He obtained human bodies and dissected them carefully, making detailed drawings of muscles, bones, and organs. He studied how muscles attached to bones, how they worked in groups to create movement, how the structure beneath the skin determined the forms visible on the surface. These investigations gave his painted figures an anatomical accuracy that added to their convincing presence, though he never included inappropriate details that would distract from the painting's purposes. Leonardo also studied the eye itself and theories of vision, pondering how we perceive depth, color, and form. He investigated the fall of light on various surfaces, how it reflected from water, how it scattered through air, how it revealed texture. All of these observations fed into his painting, making each work a synthesis of countless hours of patient study. Yet, for all his genius, Leonardo completed relatively few paintings. His curiosity pulled him in many directions, toward architecture, engineering, anatomy, geology, mathematics, and countless other fields. Commissions languished unfinished as he pursued other interests. The works he did complete often took years, as he returned repeatedly to refine effects that perhaps only he could perceive needed refinement. His influence on subsequent painters proved immense. Despite his small output, artists traveled to see the Last Supper and studied his other works wherever they could find them. His sfumato technique, his understanding of anatomy and light, his compositions, and his conviction that painting was an intellectual pursuit requiring universal knowledge, all shaped how later generations approached their art. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine Leonardo in his studio, a panel before him, building up those gossamer layers of paint, observing how each translucent glaze modified what lay beneath, studying the face emerging from his brush, contemplating the mysteries of human expression, of light, of perception itself, bringing to painting not just skill, but a mind that questioned everything and sought to understand the deepest principles underlying all visible reality. Leonardo had shown what careful observation and subtle technique could achieve, but in Rome, another kind of genius was about to transform the art of painting through sheer physical power and monumental vision. Michelangelo Buonarroti considered himself a sculptor first and foremost, yet the work he reluctantly undertook on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel became one of the most celebrated painted surfaces in all of human history. When Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo to Rome in 1508, the artist hoped for a major sculptural commission. Instead, the Pope insisted he paint the vast ceiling of the papal chapel. Michelangelo resisted at first, feeling that painting was not his true calling, and suspecting that rivals were setting him up for failure by pushing him toward a medium where they believed his skills were weaker. But Julius was not a man accustomed to hearing refusals, and eventually Michelangelo accepted the enormous challenge. The Sistine Chapel ceiling stretched more than 5,000 square feet above the floor, a barrel vault interrupted by curved triangular sections along the sides. Previous decoration had depicted a simple star-filled sky. Julius wanted something far more ambitious, initially suggesting paintings of the 12 apostles. Michelangelo countered with his own vision, far grander in scope, depicting scenes from the Book of Genesis, from the creation of the universe through the story of Noah. The Pope agreed, giving the artist remarkable freedom to realize his conception. The practical challenges were immense from the very beginning. Michelangelo had to design and construct scaffolding that would support him and his assistants high above the chapel floor, while still allowing the space below to function for services and ceremonies. He devised an ingenious platform that bridged from holes in the walls, creating a movable structure that could be repositioned as work progressed across different sections of the ceiling. Contrary to popular imagination, he did not paint lying on his back but standing, his head tilted backward at an uncomfortable angle, paint dripping down onto his face and body as he worked. The technique Michelangelo employed was buon fresco, the same demanding method that Giotto had used 2 centuries earlier. Wet plaster was applied to one section at a time, and the painting had to be completed before that plaster dried, usually within a day. This meant careful planning of each day's work area and no possibility of easy corrections. What made Michelangelo's approach distinctive was the sculptural quality he brought to his painted figures, treating them almost as if he were carving forms that thrust forward from the surface rather than receding into illusionistic space. The ceiling design organized 9 central scenes from Genesis within an architectural framework painted in trompe-l'oeil, creating the illusion of structural elements that defined rectangular and square fields. Between and around these narrative scenes, Michelangelo painted massive figures of prophets and sibyls, the seers who had foretold the coming of Christ according to theological interpretation. These figures sit in painted thrones, each one a powerful individual personality, twisting and turning with books and scrolls, lost in thought or inspiration. The most famous panel, the creation of Adam, demonstrates Michelangelo's genius for conveying profound meaning through physical form and gesture. God the Father, surrounded by angels and floating in a billowing red cloak, extends his arm toward the reclining figure of Adam. Their fingers nearly touch, and in that small gap between divine and human hands, Michelangelo captured the mysterious moment of animation when Mule and soul passed into humanity. The composition's power lies partly in its simplicity, the way everything focuses on that almost connection, that instant of becoming. Michelangelo's approach to the human body reflected his deep study of anatomy and his conviction that physical beauty reflected divine creation. His figures are muscular and monumental, painted with careful attention to how bodies twist through space, how weight settles, how muscles engage. Even elderly prophets possess powerful physiques. The Ignudi, 20 athletic nude youths painted at the corners of the central panels, serve no clear narrative function, but demonstrate Michelangelo's celebration of human form in its ideal state, positioned like living sculptures, supporting the architectural framework. The color palette Michelangelo employed surprised many when the ceiling was cleaned in the late 20th century, revealing hues far brighter than centuries of candle smoke and grime had suggested. Vibrant oranges, greens, purples and yellows emerged, showing that Michelangelo had used color boldly and expressively. His choices were not primarily naturalistic, but served to distinguish figures, create visual rhythms across the vast surface, and enhance the emotional and spiritual impact of each scene. The work progressed in two main phases. Michelangelo completed roughly half the ceiling, working from the entrance end toward the altar. By late 1510, after a break of several months, he resumed and completed the remainder by October 1512. As he worked on the later sections, his style evolved, becoming even bolder. The figures grew larger and compositions simpler, with fewer elements competing for attention. The early scenes contain many figures in relatively complex arrangements, while later panels, like the separation of light from darkness, reduce everything to the essential, showing God alone in dynamic motion against minimal background. Working largely alone, with assistants handling only preparatory tasks, and perhaps some architectural details, Michelangelo endured significant physical strain. His letters and poems from this period mention the toll the awkward position took on his body, the paint in his eyes, the ache in his neck and back. Yet he pressed forward with fierce determination, driven by his vision and perhaps by a desire to prove that he could master painting as thoroughly as sculpture, despite his own doubts when he began. When the scaffolding finally came down and the ceiling was revealed in its entirety, viewers were astonished. Here was a painted surface that possessed sculptural power, where figures seemed to exist in actual space, where the human form was rendered with unprecedented understanding of anatomy and movement. The narrative unfolded not in the gentle, approachable manner of earlier religious art, but with dramatic intensity, populated by beings of superhuman scale and presence. The influence of Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling on subsequent painting cannot be overstated. Artists traveled to Rome specifically to study it, lying on their backs as Michelangelo had stood, copying figures and absorbing lessons about composition, anatomy, and the expressive potential of the human body. The ceiling established new possibilities for what painting could achieve in terms of scale, complexity, and physical presence. It demonstrated that painting need not be subordinate to sculpture, that a flat surface could contain forms as powerful as any carved in marble. 2.5 decades later, Michelangelo would return to the Sistine Chapel to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall, but the ceiling remained his first great painted masterpiece. In accepting a commission he initially resisted, in a medium he claimed was not his own, Michelangelo created a work that would define his era's artistic achievement and continue to inspire wonder across the centuries that followed, a testament to human creative capacity reaching toward the sublime. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel still echoed with Michelangelo's thunderous vision when a young painter from the small town of Urbino arrived in Rome to witness it. Raffaello Sanzio, known to history as Raphael, stood 25 years old in the Eternal City, already recognized as a master, yet hungry to absorb everything the great achievements around him could teach. Where Michelangelo had wrestled with his art like a titan struggling against stone and plaster, Raphael would approach painting with a different spirit entirely, one of graceful synthesis and harmonious balance that would come to define the very peak of high Renaissance ideals. Raphael had learned his earliest lessons from his father, Giovanni Santi, a competent painter in the court of Urbino. That small Renaissance court, refined and cultured, had instilled in the young artist a sense of proportion and courtesy that would mark both his personality and his art. After his father's death, Raphael studied with Perugino, absorbing that master's gentle approach to composition and his soft treatment of landscape backgrounds. But Raphael possessed something beyond mere technical skill. He had an extraordinary ability to observe, to learn, and to transform what he learned into something uniquely his own. When Raphael first encountered Leonardo's work in Florence, he studied the older master's pyramidal compositions, the way figures could be arranged to lead the eye naturally through a scene. He observed Leonardo's sfumato, that gentle blurring of edges that created atmospheric softness. From Michelangelo, he learned the possibility of powerful sculptural figures. But rather than simply copying either master, Raphael found a middle path, a synthesis that balanced Leonardo's subtlety with Michelangelo's strength, creating compositions that felt both dynamic and serene, both intellectually sophisticated and immediately accessible. This gift for balance and harmony attracted the attention of Pope Julius II, the same ambitious pontiff who had commissioned Michelangelo's ceiling. In 1508, Julius invited Raphael to Rome to decorate a series of rooms in the Vatican Palace, spaces that would serve as the papal apartments and libraries. These rooms, known as the stanza, would become home to some of the most perfectly realized paintings in Western art. The first room Raphael completed, the Stanza della Segnatura, contains what many consider his masterpiece, the School of Athens. This vast fresco transforms an entire wall into an imagined gathering of history's greatest philosophers and scientists, set within a magnificent architectural space that demonstrates Raphael's complete mastery of linear perspective. The painted architecture seems to extend the actual room, creating an illusion so convincing that viewers feel they could step through the wall into that noble space where wisdom itself dwells. At the composition's heart stand Plato and Aristotle, the two pillars of ancient philosophy, walking forward in conversation. Plato, modeled on Leonardo himself, points upward toward the realm of ideal forms, while Aristotle gestures horizontally toward the observable world. This simple difference in gesture encapsulates their philosophical divide while creating a dynamic tension that energizes the entire scene. Around these central figures, Raphael arranged dozens of other thinkers in carefully balanced groups that guide the eye through the composition in a natural, effortless flow. The painting demonstrates Raphael's extraordinary skill at creating complex arrangements that never feel crowded or confused. Each figure occupies space convincingly, their bodies weighted and solid, turning and gesturing in ways that feel natural, yet purposeful. The color harmonies remain subtle and sophisticated, with no single hue dominating, but rather a gentle orchestration of earth tones, blues, and warm flesh tones that creates overall unity. The lighting, though even and clear, still suggests specific sources and creates gentle modeling that gives every form three-dimensional presence. Raphael worked rapidly, far more so than either Leonardo or Michelangelo, yet his speed never compromised quality. He had developed a systematic approach that allowed him to manage multiple large projects simultaneously. He would create careful preparatory drawings, working out compositions in small sketches, before producing full-size cartoons that could be transferred to the wall surface. His workshop, filled with talented assistants, could execute his designs for less important passages, but Raphael himself always painted the crucial faces and figures that carried the emotional and intellectual weight of each scene. In the same room as the School of Athens, Raphael painted 3 other large frescoes representing different branches of human knowledge: theology, poetry, and law. Each demonstrates the same gift for balanced composition, the same ability to organize multiple figures into coherent wholes that communicate their meaning with clarity and grace. The disputation of the Holy Sacrament places earthly and heavenly realms in perfect vertical alignment, creating a composition that feels simultaneously grounded and transcendent. Parnassus gathers the great poets around Apollo and the Muses in a flowing, musical arrangement that suggests the rhythms of poetry itself. Beyond his monumental frescoes, Raphael created numerous smaller devotional paintings that showcase different aspects of his talent. His many Madonna and child compositions explore infinite variations on this traditional theme, each finding new ways to express maternal tenderness and divine grace. These paintings demonstrate his ability to take established subjects and refresh them through subtle innovations in pose, gesture, and emotional connection between figures. The Madonna of the Goldfinch, the Madonna of the Meadow, and dozens of others show how Raphael could work within conventions while never producing anything that felt formulaic or routine. His portraits reveal yet another dimension of his skill. Unlike the psychological intensity of Leonardo's portrait work or the sculptural presence of Michelangelo's figures, Raphael's portraits capture his sitters with a directness and dignity that honors their individuality while suggesting their ideal nature. His portrait of Pope Julius shows the aged pontiff in a moment of private reflection, capturing both his worldly authority and his human weariness. Baldassare Castiglione, author of the famous book on courtly behavior, appears in Raphael's portrait as the very embodiment of Renaissance refinement and grace. The harmonious perfection of Raphael's work represented, for many viewers then and since, the absolute summit of what painting could achieve. He had absorbed all the innovations of the previous century, the mathematical perspective, the anatomical knowledge, the sophisticated use of color and light, and synthesized them into a style that seemed effortless and natural. Where Leonardo's work often carried an air of mystery, and Michelangelo's conveyed terribilità, a sense of awesome, almost frightening power, Raphael's paintings offered something different, a vision of human existence elevated to its noblest possibilities, beautiful but not remote, ideal yet still recognizably human. This very perfection, this sense of having achieved complete balance and harmony, meant that Raphael's style represented both a culmination and, in some ways, an ending. After such completeness, where could painting go? The generation of artists who followed would find themselves working in the shadow of this achievement, seeking new directions precisely because the high Renaissance ideal had been so thoroughly realized. When Raphael died suddenly in 1520 at just 37 years old, he left behind a body of work that would influence painting for centuries, but also a challenge to every artist who followed: how to move forward from perfection. User, continue exactly where you left off. Write another 200 to 250 words in the same gentle storytelling style, expanding on Raphael's legacy and transitioning smoothly into how Venetian painters would take art in a different direction, leading to chapter 40. As we move away from the perfection that Raphael achieved in Rome, we must turn our attention eastward across the Italian peninsula to a city built on water, where painting developed along an entirely different path. Venice, rising from the lagoon like a dream made of marble and light, created painters who saw the world through different eyes than their Roman and Florentine contemporaries. The very atmosphere of Venice shaped how its artists approached their craft. Morning mists rose from the canals, softening edges and blurring boundaries between water and sky. Light reflected endlessly off the lagoon's rippling surface, creating shimmering effects that changed by the hour. Sunsets painted the city in colors that seemed almost impossible, deep reds and oranges that glowed against violet shadows. Where painters in Florence had been preoccupied with line and drawing, with clear forms and mathematical precision, the Venetians became intoxicated by color itself. The city's unique position as a maritime republic also influenced its art. Venetian merchant ships traveled to Constantinople, to Syria, to Egypt and beyond, bringing back not just spices and silk, but pigments and artistic influences from the East. The city maintained close ties with Byzantine culture long after other Italian centers had moved away from it. This Eastern connection gave Venetian painting a richness and sensuality that felt different from the more intellectual approach developing in central Italy. Titian, whose career spanned much of the 16th century, became the greatest master of this Venetian tradition. Born Tiziano Vecellio in the mountain town of Pieve di Cadore, he arrived in Venice as a young boy and lived to be very old, perhaps 90 or more, giving him time to dominate Venetian painting for generations. Unlike Raphael, who died at 37, with his work representing a kind of perfection that couldn't be surpassed, Titian kept evolving, kept experimenting, kept pushing the possibilities of paint throughout his extraordinarily long life. Titian understood something fundamental about oil paint that would influence centuries of artists after him. He recognized that this medium, still relatively new compared to fresco and tempera, could be built up in layers, each one modifying those beneath it. He would begin with an underlayer, often a warm reddish-brown ground, then build up his compositions through multiple sessions, letting each layer dry before adding the next. Sometimes he would apply paint with brushes, sometimes with his fingers, sometimes even with rags, whatever would achieve the effect he wanted. In his later works especially, you can see the traces of this physical engagement with the paint itself. Thick, expressive strokes that have their own beauty, even apart from what they represent. The Venetians preferred working on canvas rather than wooden panels, partly because wood warped easily in their humid climate, but also because canvas allowed for larger paintings and could be rolled up for shipping. Venice was a commercial city, and paintings were commodities that traveled. Canvas suited their needs perfectly, and Titian became masterful at exploiting its textured surface. His earlier works show incredible precision and finish. In paintings like the Assumption of the Virgin, which hangs in the Frari Church in Venice, brilliant reds and blues surge upward with an energy that must have astonished viewers accustomed to more restrained compositions. But as Titian aged, his technique became looser, more suggestive. In his final paintings, forms seem to emerge from veils of color rather than being clearly delineated. Up close, these late works look almost abstract. Passages of thick paint in reds, browns, and golds that barely suggest what they represent. But step back, and flesh appears. Fabric catches light. Emotions register on faces, all through the magic of how our eyes blend those separate strokes of color together. Giorgione, who died young in 1510, painted very few works, but his influence on Venetian art was profound. His paintings possess a mysterious, poetic quality that's hard to describe but impossible to forget. The Tempest, one of his most famous works, shows a landscape with a nursing mother, a standing man, and an approaching storm. But what the painting actually means remains debated to this day. What matters more than any specific narrative is the mood, the way the greenish light suggests the moment before a storm breaks, the way the figures seem absorbed in their own thoughts, the way everything feels hushed and expectant. Giorgione taught Venetian painters that atmosphere itself could be a subject, that capturing a particular quality of light and air could be as important as depicting any particular story. Paolo Veronese, working in the latter part of the 16th century, brought a different sensibility to Venetian painting. His enormous canvases often depicted biblical scenes, but he filled them with contemporary Venetian life. Lavish architecture, elegant costumes, beautiful fabrics, elaborate banquets. He got in trouble with religious authorities for this approach when they questioned why his Last Supper included so many worldly details like dogs, dwarves, and German soldiers. Veronese simply renamed it Feast in the House of Levi and continued painting as he wished. His colors sing: silvery blues, pale yellows, soft greens and pinks arranged with an elegance that makes even the most crowded compositions feel harmonious. The Venetian approach to color wasn't just about using bright hues. It was about understanding how colors interact, how a touch of green makes adjacent reds more vibrant, how warm and cool tones can be woven together to create depth and atmosphere. They understood that shadows aren't simply darker versions of local colors, but contain their own colorful reflections and transitions. Where Florentine painters might outline a form and then fill it with color, Venetian painters built forms through color relationships themselves, letting edges soften and blend. This emphasis on color over line created what art historians call colorito, as opposed to disegno, color versus drawing. A debate emerged about which was more important to painting. Was the intellectual clarity of good drawing the foundation of art, as the Florentines and Romans believed, or was color, with its direct appeal to the senses and emotions, the true heart of painting, as the Venetians practiced? This wasn't merely an academic argument. It reflected different philosophies about what painting should do and how it should do it. The Venetian legacy extended far beyond the city itself. When Peter Paul Rubens visited Italy as a young man, he copied Titian's works obsessively, learning the master's techniques with color and light. Spanish kings collected Venetian paintings avidly, and Diego Velázquez studied them carefully in the royal collections. Centuries later, the Impressionists would look back to Venetian painting as a precedent for their own interest in color, light, and atmosphere. As we drift towards sleep, imagine standing in a Venetian church as afternoon light streams through high windows, illuminating a Titian altarpiece. The reds seem to glow from within. The blues recede into shadow, then emerge again. Forms appear solid, yet somehow weightless, existing in that magical space that only great painting can create. Not quite the real world, not quite heaven, but something in between, where color becomes light, becomes emotion, becomes prayer. This is the gift Venice gave to painting. This understanding that color itself could be a language as eloquent as any words. The perfection achieved by Raphael, the luminous color harmonies of Titian, the masterful balance of the High Renaissance. These accomplishments established standards that seemed impossible to surpass. By the 1520s, painters across Italy faced an intriguing challenge. Where could art go after such complete mastery of nature? Proportion and ideal beauty had been achieved. The answer that emerged would take painting in unexpected directions, creating works that stretched, twisted, and reimagined the rules that had been so carefully developed. This new approach, which would later be called Mannerism, represented not a rejection of Renaissance achievement, but rather an elaborate conversation with it. These painters had studied Michelangelo's powerful figures, Leonardo's subtle gradations, and Raphael's harmonious compositions. They understood the rules thoroughly. Now they chose to bend them deliberately, creating a more subjective, emotionally complex art that spoke to a changing world. Jacopo Pontormo worked in Florence during the 1520s, creating altarpieces that startled viewers accustomed to Renaissance clarity. In his Deposition, painted for a Florentine church, figures seemed to float in an ambiguous space without clear ground or background. The colors, pinks, blues, and greens, appear sharp and somewhat unnatural rather than harmoniously blended. Bodies twist in elaborate poses, their proportions elongated and graceful, but not quite realistic. The emotional intensity is palpable, yet different from the straightforward drama of earlier religious painting. Everything feels slightly dreamlike, as though the sacred event exists in a realm beyond normal physical laws. This new style emerged partly from historical circumstances. The 1527 sack of Rome had shattered assumptions about stability and order in Italian life. The Protestant Reformation challenged religious certainties, The cultural confidence of the High Renaissance gave way to something more anxious and introspective. Mannerist painters seemed to channel this uncertainty into visual terms, creating sophisticated works that acknowledged complexity and ambiguity. Francesco Mazzola, known as Parmigianino, took these tendencies even further in northern Italy. His Madonna with the long neck, painted in the 1530s, presents the Virgin Mary with an impossibly elongated body, her neck and fingers stretched into elegant, swan-like forms. The Christ child appears unusually large, draped across her lap in a pose both graceful and slightly unsettling. In the background, a single column rises without any building around it, and a tiny figure holds a scroll in a space that makes no logical sense. The painting's beauty is undeniable, yet it operates by rules entirely its own, prioritizing grace and emotional effect over natural proportion. These painters developed technical approaches as distinctive as their visions. Rather than building forms through careful light and shadow, as Leonardo had done, many Mannerist works featured sharper contrasts and more arbitrary lighting. Colors might be chosen for emotional or aesthetic impact rather than naturalistic observation. Compositions became more complex and crowded, sometimes deliberately difficult to read at first glance, rewarding sustained attention with layers of meaning. Agnolo Bronzino, working for the Medici court in Florence, brought Mannerist principles to portraiture. His images of Florentine aristocrats present figures of almost supernatural elegance and poise, their smooth, porcelain-like skin and elaborate costumes rendered with extraordinary precision. Yet these portraits feel curiously distant and cool, the subject's expressions carefully controlled, revealing little of their inner lives. This emotional reserve itself made a statement about courtly sophistication and self-control, transforming portraiture into something more conceptual than earlier Renaissance examples. Across Europe, different regions developed their own relationships with these ideas. In Spain, a painter born in Crete and trained in Venice would take Mannerist tendencies to visionary extremes. Domenicos Theotokopoulos, known as El Greco, arrived in Toledo in the 1570s and created works unlike anything seen before. His figures stretched even more dramatically than Parmigianino's, their bodies flame-like and elongated. His colors, acid yellows, cool blues, sharp greens, shimmer with an almost supernatural intensity. El Greco's technique involved visible, energetic brushwork, quite different from the smooth blending favored by earlier masters. In paintings like The Burial of the Count of Orgaz, earthly and heavenly realms exist in the same picture, but follow different visual rules. The lower section, depicting Toledo nobles at a funeral, maintains some connection to natural appearance. The upper section, showing heaven, becomes a swirling vision of elongated saints and angels, all color and movement and spiritual intensity. The painting breathes with mystical fervor, using distortion and unusual color, not as mistakes, but as tools to convey religious transcendence. The question of why El Greco painted this way has fascinated observers for centuries. Some suggested he had vision problems that distorted what he saw, but this theory doesn't hold up. He could paint naturalistically when he chose to, and his portraits demonstrate clear observation. Instead, his style seems to have been a deliberate choice, a way of expressing the spiritual intensity of counter-Reformation Spain through visual means that went beyond mere representation. Mannerist painters also experimented with space in new ways. Rather than the clear mathematical perspective that had excited early Renaissance painters, they created more complex spatial arrangements. Figures might be crowded into the foreground with little depth behind them, or space might become ambiguous and hard to read. This wasn't due to lack of skill. These painters understood perspective perfectly, but rather represented a choice to prioritize other concerns over spatial clarity. The materials and techniques these painters used remained largely traditional: oil paint on canvas or panel, fresco on walls. But they employed them in increasingly personal ways. The systematic methods described in workshop manuals gave way to more individual approaches. Some painters built up surfaces with visible texture. Others maintained smooth finishes, but used color in unexpected combinations. The idea of the artist as a unique creative intelligence, rather than a skilled craftsman following established patterns, gained strength during this period. In Venice, Tintoretto combined Mannerist energy with Venetian color tradition, creating vast religious compositions that seemed to explode with movement. His Last Supper, painted near the end of the 16th century, presents the familiar scene from a dramatic diagonal angle, with the table rushing back into space and the room filled with swirling angels visible only to spiritual sight. The contrast with Leonardo's serene, frontal treatment of the same subject a century earlier demonstrates how completely painting's concerns had shifted. Not everyone appreciated these developments. Some critics felt Mannerist painters had lost their way, abandoning nature for arbitrary invention. Giorgio Vasari, himself a Mannerist painter and the first great art historian, defended the style as demonstrating refined skill and sophisticated judgment. The debate itself was significant. It showed that people were thinking critically about art's purposes and methods, developing vocabulary to discuss style and meaning. As the 16th century drew toward its close, Mannerism's influence spread through prints and traveling artists. Yet painting was about to transform again. The stage was being set for artists who would return to nature with fresh eyes, using dramatic light and shadow to create works of unprecedented immediacy and power. The techniques and materials remained largely the same, but the vision would soon shift once more, as it had so many times throughout painting's long story. The light in Rome had a particular quality at the turn of the 17th century, as the Church sought to renew its spiritual authority through art that could move the soul and stir the senses. Into this atmosphere of religious fervor and artistic ambition came a painter whose name would become synonymous with dramatic shadow and piercing illumination. Michelangelo Merisi, known to history as Caravaggio after his hometown near Milan, arrived in Rome around 1592 as a young man with considerable talent and an entirely new vision of how paint could capture reality. What made Caravaggio revolutionary was not merely his technical skill, though that was formidable, but his radical approach to light itself. Where earlier painters had used light to model forms gently and create atmospheric space, Caravaggio wielded light like a blade, carving his subjects from absolute darkness. This technique, which came to be known as tenebrism, from the Italian word for shadowy or gloomy, created paintings of startling immediacy and emotional power. A single candle or shaft of light would pierce the blackness, illuminating a face, a gesture, a moment of profound human experience suspended in time. In his painting of the Calling of St. Matthew, created for the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, we can see this technique in its full power. Christ enters from the right, his hand extended in a gesture that echoes the hand of Adam in Michelangelo's Sistine chapel ceiling. But everything else about the scene breaks with tradition. The setting is not some idealized ancient space, but what appears to be a contemporary Roman tavern. Matthew sits at a table counting money with other figures dressed in the clothing of Caravaggio's own time. The light enters from an unseen source, following the direction of Christ's gesture, transforming an ordinary moment into one charged with divine significance. This mingling of the sacred and the everyday was perhaps Caravaggio's most controversial innovation. He painted saints and biblical figures, not as idealized types, but as real people, often using ordinary Romans as his models. For his painting of the Madonna in the Cavalletti Chapel, he used a woman from the streets as his model, painting her with bare feet and a swollen belly. The painting was rejected as inappropriate for a church, yet Caravaggio's insistence on this gritty realism was deliberate. In the wake of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church wanted art that could speak directly to ordinary believers, and Caravaggio took this mandate literally, bringing biblical scenes into the realm of lived human experience. His method of working was as unconventional as his subjects. While most painters of his era made careful preparatory drawings and built up their compositions in layers, Caravaggio appears to have worked directly on the canvas with little preparation. X-rays of his paintings reveal few underdrawings and many adjustments made as he painted, suggesting he composed with the brush itself, responding to the living model before him. He would pose his models in his studio, then manipulate light sources, probably using candles or lamps with reflectors, to create the precise dramatic effects he sought. The technical demands of his approach were considerable. To achieve the deep, luminous blacks that give his work such power, he would begin with dark ground layers, building up from shadow rather than from light, as was conventional. His highlights were applied with careful precision, often in thick impasto that catches actual light, making a painted gleam seem to possess its own luminosity. The result was paintings that seemed to glow from within, where figures emerged from darkness, as if caught in a sudden, revealing flash. In the Conversion of St. Paul, painted for the Charasi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, Caravaggio places us directly beneath the fallen figure of Paul, his arms outstretched in his moment of divine encounter on the road to Damascus. A massive horse looms above him, its handler struggling to control it in the confined space. Again, the light comes from no natural source, illuminating this transformative moment with supernatural clarity. The composition is bold to the point of audacity, yet it draws the viewer into the scene with irresistible immediacy. This directness, this refusal to idealize or prettify, made Caravaggio's work deeply influential, but also controversial. He received major commissions and found important patrons, yet he lived a turbulent life, frequently involved in disputes and brawls. His paintings were sometimes rejected by the very churches that commissioned them, judged too raw or undignified for sacred spaces. Yet other artists recognized immediately the power of what he had achieved. The impact of Caravaggio's innovations spread rapidly across Europe. Artists who saw his work in Rome carried his techniques northward. The dramatic lighting, the use of ordinary models, the emotional intensity, and the psychological depth became tools that painters everywhere could employ. In Utrecht, artists like Hendrik ter Bruggen adopted his tenebrism. In Spain, the young Velázquez studied his work. In France, Georges de la Tour created candlelit scenes that owed everything to Caravaggio's example. Even in regions where his work was not directly known, his influence spread through the paintings of those who had studied his methods. What Caravaggio understood, perhaps more profoundly than any painter before him, was that light in a painting could do more than illuminate. It could narrate. It could direct attention, create mood, suggest the presence of the divine, and reveal the inner states of human beings. His light is never neutral or even. It is selective, theatrical, meaningful. It tells us where to look and what to feel. In this way, he transformed light from a technical challenge into a primary language of painting, as important as drawing or color. His final years were spent in exile after a violent incident in Rome, wandering between Naples, Malta, and Sicily, still painting works of tremendous power, even as his personal circumstances grew increasingly desperate. He died in 1610 at the age of 38, attempting to return to Rome where a pardon awaited him. Yet in his brief career, he had fundamentally altered the course of European painting, opening possibilities that artists would explore for generations to come. As we settle into the broader story of Baroque painting that would dominate the 17th century, we carry with us the example of Caravaggio, the painter who showed that darkness could be as expressive as light, and that the most profound spiritual truths might be found not in idealized beauty, but in the dramatic, shadow-wrapped reality of ordinary human experience transformed by a single, revelatory beam of illumination. Following Caravaggio's revolutionary use of dramatic light and shadow, painting in the 17th century blossomed into what we now call the Baroque period, a time when art embraced movement, emotion, and theatrical grandeur. But the Baroque was never one single style. Instead, it manifested differently across the various centers of European culture, shaped by local traditions, religious contexts, and the distinct visions of individual masters who transformed its principles in their own unique ways. In Flanders, Peter Paul Rubens became the embodiment of Baroque energy and abundance. Born in 1577, Rubens traveled to Italy as a young man, where he absorbed lessons from the Renaissance masters and from Caravaggio's dramatic lighting. When he returned north to Antwerp, he synthesized these influences into something distinctly his own. Rubens painted with an exuberance that seemed to match his personality. His canvases overflow with robust figures, swirling compositions, and rich, warm colors. The flesh in his paintings appears to glow with life, rendered with confident brushwork that suggested form and movement rather than laboriously detailing every surface. He painted enormous altarpieces for churches, mythological scenes for aristocratic patrons, and diplomatic portraits for rulers across Europe. His workshop became legendary, employing numerous assistants who helped him fulfill the constant stream of commissions. Yet Rubens himself would add the final touches, the passages that brought each work to life with his characteristic vitality. His approach to painting was generous and expansive, celebrating physical presence and emotional intensity in equal measure. Far to the south, in Spain, Diego Velázquez developed a very different interpretation of Baroque principles. Appointed court painter to King Philip IV in Madrid while still in his 20s, Velázquez spent most of his career painting the Spanish royal family and their court. But within these constraints, he achieved something extraordinary. Velázquez possessed an almost magical ability to suggest reality through economical brushwork. Where other painters might labor over details, Velázquez learned to place strokes of color with such precision that they resolved into convincing forms when viewed from the proper distance. His painting technique became increasingly free as he matured, yet the illusion of reality he created only grew stronger. In works like Las Meninas, he explored complex spatial arrangements and the nature of seeing itself, placing the viewer in an ambiguous relationship with the scene depicted. His portraits, even of court dwarfs and jesters, conveyed profound human dignity. Velázquez understood that painting could be both a technical marvel and a philosophical meditation on appearance and truth. In the Dutch Republic, far from the courts and churches that commissioned grand Baroque statements, Rembrandt van Rijn pursued a deeply personal artistic vision. Born in Leiden in 1606, Rembrandt achieved early success in Amsterdam with dramatic group portraits and biblical scenes. He absorbed Caravaggio's influence through followers who had traveled to Italy, but transformed that dramatic lighting into something more introspective. Rembrandt painted light not merely as illumination, but as a spiritual presence, a gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from within his subjects. As he aged, his technique became increasingly expressive, building up surfaces with thick layers of paint that caught actual light on their textured surfaces. He applied pigment with brushes, palette knives, and even his fingers, creating passages of extraordinary richness. His later self-portrait, painted with unflinching honesty as he examined his aging face, ink among the most psychologically profound images in Western art. Where other Baroque painters sought grandeur, Rembrandt found something equally powerful in introspection and intimate human emotion. France developed its own relationship with Baroque painting, one tempered by classical restraint. Nicolas Poussin, though he spent most of his career in Rome, became the father of French classical painting. Poussin approached painting with an intellectual rigor that balanced Baroque drama with Renaissance harmony. He carefully constructed his compositions, sometimes arranging small wax figures to study lighting and arrangement before beginning to paint. His works depicted mythological and biblical subjects with clarity and dignity, organizing figures in frieze-like arrangements across the picture plane. His colors were clear and bright, his forms solid and sculptural. Poussin believed painting should appeal to the mind as much as the eye, that it should embody noble thoughts and moral clarity. This rational approach to Baroque principles would influence French academic painting for centuries to come. Each of these masters worked with oil paint on canvas, the medium that had become standard across Europe, but they employed it in remarkably different ways. Rubens painted with fluid confidence, often on large canvases prepared with light grounds that enhanced his luminous colors. Velázquez developed an increasingly sketchy technique, where individual brushstrokes remained visible, anticipating approaches that would not become common until centuries later. Rembrandt built up dense, crusty surfaces in some areas, while leaving others thin and translucent, creating paintings that were almost sculptural in their physicality. Poussin maintained smooth, controlled surfaces, where the technique never called attention to itself, allowing the composition and subject to dominate. The contexts in which they worked shaped their art as profoundly as their individual talents. Rubens, working in Catholic Flanders during the Counter-Reformation, created paintings meant to inspire religious devotion and demonstrate the wealth and power of the church. Velázquez, in the formal atmosphere of the Spanish court, perfected the art of diplomatic portraiture while exploring the nature of representation itself. Rembrandt, in the Protestant Dutch Republic with its prosperous merchant class, could pursue more personal artistic goals, though financial pressures and changing tastes challenged him throughout his life. Poussin, working for educated collectors in Rome and Paris, created paintings that rewarded intellectual engagement and knowledge of classical literature. Yet for all their differences, these Baroque masters shared certain qualities. They all understood how to create convincing, three-dimensional space on flat surfaces, building on Renaissance discoveries. They all used light dramatically, whether Rubens' warm illumination, Velázquez's subtle atmospheric effects, Rembrandt's spiritual radiance, or Poussin's clear daylight. They all sought to engage viewers emotionally, whether through Baroque drama or classical restraint, and they all possessed complete mastery of their medium, able to make oil paint describe any texture, any surface, any effect of light they desired. The 17th century demonstrated that painting had become a fully mature art form, capable of expressing the widest range of human experience and thought. As these Baroque masters explored different possibilities within their cultural contexts, they collectively expanded what painting could achieve, creating works that continue to move viewers centuries after the pigments dried on the canvas. After the grandeur and drama of Baroque painting across Europe's royal courts and Catholic churches, something remarkable was happening in the northern Netherlands. In the small, prosperous Dutch Republic of the 17th century, painters were creating an entirely different kind of art, one that turned away from mythological gods and biblical drama to focus instead on the quiet poetry of everyday life. This transformation emerged from the unique circumstances of Dutch society. The Netherlands had won independence from Catholic Spain and embraced Protestant values that viewed religious imagery with suspicion. There were no powerful church officials commissioning altar paintings, no absolute monarchs demanding ceiling frescoes celebrating their divine right to rule. Instead, the Dutch Republic was a nation of merchants, shopkeepers, and skilled craftsmen who had grown wealthy through trade and commerce. These middle-class citizens wanted paintings too, but not the monumental canvases that filled palaces elsewhere in Europe. They wanted pictures sized for their comfortable but modest homes, depicting the world they knew and valued. And so Dutch painters specialized in ways that would have seemed strange in Rome or Paris. Some artists painted nothing but still lifes, arranging fruits and flowers, shells and butterflies, cheeses and silver goblets on tabletops. Others devoted themselves exclusively to landscapes, capturing the flat Dutch countryside with its wide skies and windmills. Marine painters depicted the ships that brought Holland its prosperity, while others focused on city views or church interiors or scenes of tavern life. This specialization allowed painters to achieve extraordinary mastery in their chosen subjects. The surfaces of these paintings often displayed a technical virtuosity that seems almost miraculous. A lemon peel would curl in a spiral so convincing you could almost smell the citrus. Dewdrops on flower petals caught tiny reflections of windows. The texture of velvet, the translucence of a glass of wine, the weathered grain of wooden tables. All were rendered with obsessive precision. Dutch painters had inherited the oil painting techniques perfected by their Flemish neighbours to the south, and they applied these methods with infinite patience and care. Yet beneath the surface, beauty of these paintings lay layers of meaning that contemporary viewers would have recognized immediately. A painting of a tavern scene showing young people drinking and flirting might seem merely entertaining, but it carried warnings about the dangers of excess and lost virtue. Still life paintings, called vanitas pictures, reminded viewers of life's brevity through symbolic objects. A skull representing death, an hourglass marking time's passage, a guttering candle symbolizing life's fragility, soap bubbles showing how quickly beauty fades. Even the most cheerful flower painting contained a memento mori, a reminder of mortality, since those blooms would soon wither and die. Among these specialists emerged painters of such remarkable talent that their works transcend their time and place. Johannes Vermeer, working quietly in the city of Delft, created perhaps 36 paintings in his lifetime, each one a meditation on light and stillness. Vermeer's canvases typically show 1 or 2 figures in domestic interiors, engaged in simple activities, reading a letter, pouring milk, playing music. The rooms are modest but comfortable, with tile floors and plastered walls. But what makes these paintings extraordinary is the quality of light that fills them. Vermeer positioned his subjects near windows, allowing natural daylight to flood across the scene. This light seems almost palpable as it falls across a blue jacket or illuminates a pearl earring. Colors glow with inner radiance. The yellows and blues that Vermeer favored appear luminous yet soft. He may have used a camera obscura, an optical device that projected images onto surfaces to study how light actually behaves. Whether he did or not, his understanding of optical effects was profound. Highlights sparkle with broken touches of paint. Edges soften where forms recede into shadow. The paint itself is applied with subtle variation, sometimes smooth and blended, sometimes built up in small points of impasto to catch the light. The mood in Vermeer's paintings invites quiet contemplation. A woman stands absorbed in reading a letter, and we sense the privacy of that moment, the intimacy of written words. Another pours milk from a jug in an act so ordinary it usually passes unnoticed. Yet Vermeer elevates it to something almost sacred through the attention he brings to the play of morning light on the milk's arc, on the rough plaster wall, on the bread and brass vessels arranged on the table. Time seems suspended in these images. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels significant. Other Dutch masters brought different sensibilities to similar subjects. Pieter de Hooch specialized in domestic courtyards and interiors, where doorways and windows created geometric patterns of light and shade. drawing the eye through multiple spaces. His paintings of mothers with children or maids sweeping tiled floors celebrated the orderly virtue of Dutch household life. The paintings of Gerard Terborch depicted wealthy citizens in their finest clothes, gleaming satins rendered so convincingly that viewers could distinguish the weight and texture of different fabrics. In landscape painting, Jacob van Ruysdael captured the drama of the Dutch countryside, where dark storm clouds rolled across enormous skies above windmills and waterways. His paintings balanced careful observation of nature with emotional power. The struggle of trees bent by constant wind, the way sunlight breaks through clouds to illuminate a distant church. Albert Cuyp painted pastoral scenes bathed in golden afternoon light, where cattle grazed peacefully beside rivers that reflected the warm glow of the sky. The still life painters achieved effects that still astonish viewers today. Willem Kalf arranged luxurious objects, oriental carpets, Chinese porcelain, nautical shells, half-peeled lemons, ornate silver vessels, in compositions that celebrated both material prosperity and the painter's skill in depicting it. Light would catch the spiral of lemon peel, gleam on the silver, and glow through the amber liquid in a wine glass, with such realism that the painted objects seemed more vivid than reality itself. These paintings were produced for an art market, unlike anything seen before. While artists elsewhere depended on commissions from specific patrons, many Dutch painters created works speculatively, selling them through dealers or at fairs. This commercialization of art had both advantages and challenges. Painters could follow their own interests and visions, but they also faced competition and economic uncertainty. Some, like Vermeer, struggled financially despite creating masterpieces. Others, like the landscape specialists, produced prolifically for a steady market. What united these diverse painters was their choice to find profound meaning in the familiar world around them. They demonstrated that paintings need not depict saints or gods, heroes or kings to achieve greatness. A simple room with light falling through a window, a table set with bread and herring, a view of houses beside a canal under a clouded sky. These ordinary subjects, when observed with sufficient attention and painted with consummate skill, could become vehicles for reflection on the texture and meaning of human existence. As the 17th century progressed and the Dutch Golden Age eventually faded, the innovations of these painters would continue to resonate. They had proven that painting could serve as a mirror to everyday reality, capturing the poetry hidden in humble moments and common things. The world of painting in 18th century Europe found itself dancing between two distinct moods, two different ways of seeing and feeling. As we settle into this chapter of our journey through art history, we find ourselves in elegant drawing rooms and grand academies, witnessing a transformation that would mirror the dramatic political and philosophical changes sweeping across the continent. The century opened with a style we now call Rococo, a word perhaps derived from the French rocaille, referring to the shell-like decorative motifs that adorned so many surfaces of the period. This was painting that seemed to float, that preferred pastel colors to the dark intensities of the Baroque, that chose pleasure gardens over biblical dramas. The Rococo sensibility emerged first in France, particularly in the aristocratic circles of Paris, where art served increasingly as decoration for refined living rather than as religious instruction or political propaganda. Antoine Watteau, working in the early decades of the century, created paintings that captured moments of elegant leisure with a melancholic undertone. His invention of the fête galante, depicting well-dressed figures in parkland settings, established a new genre entirely. These weren't portraits of specific people at particular events, but rather dreamlike visions of an idealized aristocratic life. Watteau's brushwork possessed a feathery delicacy, his colors shimmering with subtle gradations. When we look at his masterpiece, Pilgrimage to Cythera, we see couples in sumptuous silks, preparing to depart from the mythical island of love, the whole scene suffused with a wistful quality, as though beauty itself were always on the verge of fading. The technique Watteau employed involved building up thin layers of paint, allowing the white ground to reflect light back through the colors, creating luminosity. He sketched endlessly from life, filling notebooks with studies of hands, heads, and fabric folds that he would later recombine in his compositions. This practice gave his imaginary scenes a convincing naturalism, even as they depicted a world of fantasy. François Boucher carried the Rococo aesthetic further into the realm of pure decorative pleasure. Working under the patronage of Madame de Pompadour, the influential mistress of King Louis XV, Boucher created paintings of mythological subjects rendered in clouds of pink and blue. His canvases depicted Venus and Cupid, shepherdesses and nymphs, all painted with a porcelain-like finish that matched the delicate objects filling Rococo interiors. The paint itself seemed to take on the qualities of silk and flesh, everything soft and inviting to the eye. Jean-Honoré Fragonard, perhaps the last great Rococo painter, brought tremendous energy to his brushwork. His painting The Swing perfectly encapsulates the playful eroticism and decorative brilliance of the style, with a young woman suspended in air, her shoe flying off, while a hidden lover watches from the bushes below. Fragonard could paint with astonishing speed, his brush dancing across the canvas to capture rustling fabric and dappled light filtering through leaves. Yet beneath the apparent frivolity, there existed real technical sophistication in how he constructed space and controlled the viewer's eye through color and composition. But even as Rococo painting reached its peak of refinement, other forces were gathering. The middle decades of the 18th century saw the rediscovery of the ancient Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried by volcanic ash for 17 centuries. These excavations sparked enormous interest in classical antiquity throughout Europe. Simultaneously, Enlightenment philosophy emphasized reason, virtue, and civic duty over aristocratic pleasure. The stage was being set for a dramatic shift in artistic direction. Neoclassicism emerged as a conscious rejection of Rococo's decorative values in favor of what artists and theorists considered the nobler principles of Greek and Roman art. This new style demanded clarity over complexity, straight lines over curves, moral seriousness over playful wit. The paint itself was applied differently, in smooth, carefully blended layers that concealed the artist's brushwork rather than celebrating it. Colors became more muted, compositions more stable and balanced. Jacques-Louis David became the supreme master of this neoclassical approach. His painting, Oath of the Horatii, completed in 1784, announced a new artistic era as clearly as any single work could. The canvas depicts three Roman brothers swearing to fight for their city, their father holding up swords while women grieve to the side. Everything about the painting contradicts Rococo principles. The figures are sculptural and clearly defined, arranged in a shallow space against stark arches. The colors are somber. The subject concerns sacrifice and duty rather than pleasure. Even David's technique emphasized discipline, with invisible brushstrokes creating smooth surfaces and sharp contours. David had traveled to Rome to study ancient sculpture and Renaissance masters, particularly Raphael and Poussin. He sketched endlessly from classical statuary, absorbing their proportions and poses. His paintings required extensive preparatory work, including detailed drawings and small oil studies. Every element was planned, nothing left to spontaneous inspiration. This methodical approach reflected neoclassical values of reason and control. The French Revolution transformed David from a painter of classical themes into an artist of contemporary political drama. He painted revolutionary martyrs and designed propaganda festivals, though always maintaining his clear, classical style. His most ambitious work, The Coronation of Napoleon, demonstrated that neoclassical techniques could capture contemporary pageantry on an enormous scale, with the careful arrangement of dozens of precisely rendered figures. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, David's most accomplished student, carried neoclassicism into the 19th century, while developing his own distinctive approach. Ingres became obsessed with line, which he considered more fundamental than color to painting's power. His portraits and history paintings featured figures with impossibly smooth skin and impossibly precise contours. He would spend years on a single canvas, adjusting and refining until every curve satisfied him. Though critics sometimes pointed out anatomical distortions in his work, these were deliberate choices in service of visual harmony rather than mistakes. The shift from Rococo to Neoclassicism involved more than changing subject matter or color palettes. It reflected competing philosophies about what painting should accomplish. Should art provide pleasure and decoration, or instruction and moral improvement? Should painters follow their personal vision and feeling, or submit to established rules derived from classical examples? These questions would continue to animate artistic debate long after both styles had given way to new movements. As the 18th century drew to a close, the technical foundations of Western painting stood complete. Artists commanded sophisticated oil techniques developed over centuries. They understood perspective, anatomy, color theory, and composition. They could paint anything, from any angle in any light. This mastery created both opportunity and challenge. For what remained to be discovered when everything seemed already known? The answers would emerge in the revolutionary century to follow, building upon all that had come before. As we reach the end of our journey through the story of painting, we find ourselves standing at a remarkable threshold. By the early 19th century, artists had assembled a magnificent toolkit of techniques, materials, and concepts that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years. The foundation was complete, sturdy, and rich with possibility. Think of all that had been achieved. Painters had learned to grind minerals and mix pigments that could survive centuries. They had discovered how to bind these colored powders with egg yolk, with oil, with water, and gum arabic. each medium offering its own distinctive qualities. They had mastered the chemistry of preparing surfaces, from cave walls to wooden panels to stretched canvas, understanding how each ground would receive and hold their marks. The technical knowledge alone represented an extraordinary inheritance. Artists understood how to create the smooth surface required for fine detail, and how to build up layers of glaze that seemed to glow from within. They knew which pigments could be mixed safely, and which would turn muddy or deteriorate when combined. They had learned to work wet plaster quickly before it dried, and to apply oil paint slowly, waiting for layers to cure before adding the next. This practical wisdom had been earned through countless experiments, passed from master to apprentice across generations. But the technical achievements were only part of the foundation. Painters had also developed a sophisticated visual language for representing the three-dimensional world on flat surfaces. The discovery of linear perspective had given them the mathematical tools to create convincing architectural spaces and landscapes that seemed to recede naturally into the distance. Atmospheric perspective allowed them to suggest depth through the subtle manipulation of color and clarity. They had studied how light fell across different surfaces, how it created highlights and shadows that described form and volume. The understanding of human anatomy had progressed enormously, from those first cave paintings of animals and the stylized figures of ancient Egypt. Artists had learned the structure beneath the skin, the way muscles attached to bone, how the body moved and balanced and expressed emotion through gesture. Faces could now convey the subtlest feelings. Hands could speak their own eloquent language, and bodies could inhabit painted space with convincing weight and presence. Beyond technique and representation, painters had explored countless approaches to their art, each shaped by the culture and moment that produced it. They had created images for spiritual purposes, as windows to the divine or aids to devotion. They had celebrated power and wealth, documenting the faces and possessions of those who could afford to commission their services. They had told stories from mythology, religion, and history, making distant events vivid and immediate. They had turned their attention to the everyday world, finding beauty in ordinary domestic scenes, in landscapes, in arrangements of fruit and flowers on a table. Different traditions had valued different qualities. In China, painters had learned to suggest entire landscapes with just a few brushstrokes of ink, emphasizing harmony with nature and the spiritual essence of a scene rather than detailed realism. In Venice, artists had reveled in sensuous color and light, building up glowing surfaces that seemed alive with atmosphere. In Holland, painters had developed an extraordinary ability to capture specific effects of light and texture, making simple interiors feel precious and contemplative. Each approach had enriched the vocabulary of painting, showing that there were many valid ways to transform pigment on a surface into meaningful experience. The status of painters themselves had been transformed over these centuries. Those first artists in caves remain anonymous to us, and we can only guess at their position in their communities. Egyptian painters were skilled craftspeople working within strict conventions, but by the Renaissance, figures like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael had achieved fame and respect that elevated their profession to a liberal art, an intellectual pursuit worthy of the finest minds. Artists were no longer merely skilled workers, but creative thinkers who understood mathematics, optics, anatomy, and philosophy. This foundation, so carefully built over thousands of years, would prove essential for everything that followed. As the 19th century progressed, painters would begin to question and ultimately dismantle many of these hard-won conventions. They would ask whether representing reality accurately was actually the highest goal of painting. They would explore what happened when you prioritized color over line, impression over detail, emotion over observation, abstraction over representation. But even these revolutionaries built upon the foundation they inherited, understanding the rules thoroughly before choosing which to break and which to keep. Lying here now, contemplating this vast sweep of human creativity, we can appreciate the continuity that runs through the story of painting. Every innovation built upon what came before. Giotto learned from Byzantine icons even as he transformed them. Leonardo studied the Flemish masters' oil techniques. Caravaggio understood Venetian colorism even as he plunged his scenes into dramatic shadow. Each generation of painters inherited the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors and added their own insights to the tradition. The materials themselves connect past and future. Some of the pigments used today are the same ones ground by painters in ancient Egypt, while others were discovered through centuries of experimentation. The principles of preparing a canvas or mixing oils have been refined over generations, but remain fundamentally similar to methods developed centuries ago. When contemporary painters pick up their brushes, they participate in techniques that have been practiced in essentially the same way for hundreds of years. What remains most striking about this foundation is how sturdy it proved to be. Despite enormous changes in artistic philosophy and approach, the basic elements established by the early 19th century continue to matter. Artists still grapple with how to organize space on a flat surface, how to use color expressively, how to balance representation and abstraction, how to convey meaning through visual means. The questions that engaged painters in Renaissance Florence or Baroque Rome remain relevant, even if contemporary answers look very different. As we complete our story, we can rest knowing that the art of painting, in all its variety and possibility, grew from simple beginnings into something magnificently complex. From hands pressed against cave walls to the sophisticated masterpieces hanging in the world's great museums, painting represents humanity's enduring desire to make visible our inner and outer worlds, to capture beauty and meaning, to communicate across time and space through the universal language of images. The foundation was complete, but the story of painting would continue, building ever upward and outward from this solid base, finding new questions to ask and new ways to answer them, proving that human creativity, like the art it produces, knows no final boundary. As we bring to a close our journey through the art of painting, from those first handprints on ancient cave walls to the glowing masterpieces of the Renaissance, we hope these stories of color, light, and human creativity have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.